Beneath the streets we walk lies another world entirely. For thousands of years across continents and civilizations, humans have carved vast networks into the earth, complete cities, hidden from daylight. These weren't built on whim. They were born from necessity, from fear, and from secrets their builders carried to their graves. Tonight we'll descend into some of the most remarkable underground cities ever discovered. Not through speculation, but through the careful work of archaeologists and historians who have spent decades mapping these hidden worlds. We'll examine the evidence tool marks on ancient walls, ventilation systems still functioning after millennia, documents revealing Cold War paranoia and mysteries that remain unsolved. This is scholarship, but it's also profoundly human. It's about people who chose darkness to survive governments, preparing for wars that never came, and secrets waiting beneath our feet. We'll move carefully, taking time to understand not just what was built, but why. These places deserve our patience. Our journey begins in Cappadocia, Turkey, exploring Derinkuyu, 18 stories deep, sheltering 20,000 people. Then to Paris, where 6 million rest in walls of bone beneath the streets. To Beijing's massive Cold War shelter, dug by hand. We'll investigate Moscow's rumored Metro 2, Britain's secret Burlington, and America's network of underground facilities. Throughout we'll ask, why do humans build underground? What drives us to create these hidden refuges? Let's begin. In the summer of 1963, a man living in the town of Derinkuyu in central Turkey decided to renovate his home. The house was modest, like many others in this region of Cappadocia, built from the same pale volcanic stone that characterizes the landscape. He was working in his basement, planning to create more storage space, when his sledgehammer broke through what he thought was a solid wall. Instead of finding more rock behind it, he found darkness, a void that seemed to extend far beyond where his light could reach. What this homeowner had discovered quite by accident would prove to be one of the most remarkable archaeological finds of the 20th century. Behind that basement wall lay the entrance to an entire city, carved deep into the bedrock beneath the town. Not just a few rooms or a small shelter, but a vast multi-level complex that descended 18 stories into the earth, reaching a depth of approximately 85 meters. This was Derinkuyu, the largest known underground city in Turkey, and possibly in the world. The discovery immediately attracted the attention of archaeologists and historians. As they began to explore and map the site, the scale of what had been hidden beneath this quiet town became increasingly clear. This wasn't a natural cave system that had been adapted for human use. Every corridor, every room, every ventilation shaft had been deliberately carved from the soft volcanic tough stone that lies beneath the Cappadocia region. The amount of labor this would have required was staggering. Thousands of workers working for years, perhaps generations, removing tons of rock to create this subterranean refuge. Let's consider what the researchers found as they descended into Derinkuyu. The city was organized with remarkable sophistication. The upper levels contained living quarters, small rooms where families would have slept, eaten, and carried on their daily lives in the absence of natural light. These weren't crude caves, but carefully planned spaces with niches carved into the walls for oil lamps, small alcoves for storage, and even stone beds in some areas. The ceilings were high enough for people to stand comfortably, and the rooms were connected by corridors wide enough for several people to pass. As the exploration continued deeper, archaeologists discovered communal spaces. There were large rooms that appeared to have served as gathering halls, places where the underground community could come together. They found what were clearly kitchens, identifiable by the presence of stone hearths and channels carved to direct smoke upward through the ventilation system. There were storage rooms for food, large chambers with carved niches, and shelves where grain, dried fruits, and other provisions could be kept. The cool, stable temperature of the underground environment would have helped preserve these supplies for extended periods. One of the most impressive features was the presence of wine and oil presses. These weren't small domestic installations, but substantial facilities capable of producing significant quantities. The presence of these presses tells us something important. The people who built Derinkuyu weren't just creating an emergency shelter for brief periods of danger. They were preparing for extended stays underground, maintaining not just survival, but something approaching normal life. The ventilation system represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Derinkuyu's engineering. 52 ventilation shafts were carved through the rock, some extending all the way from the surface down to the lowest levels. These shafts, carefully positioned throughout the complex, allowed fresh air to circulate even in the deepest chambers. Modern engineers who have studied the system remain impressed by its effectiveness. The builders understood principles of airflow and pressure that wouldn't be formally documented in scientific literature for centuries. Without this ventilation system, the deeper levels would have been uninhabitable. The air would have become stale and dangerous within hours, with thousands of people breathing in enclosed spaces. Water was supplied through wells that reached down to underground aquifers. The city's designers ensured that water was accessible on multiple levels, so residents wouldn't need to travel to the surface or to the deepest levels to obtain it. The water distribution system included channels carved into the stone floors to direct water where it was needed, and to manage drainage. Among the most striking discoveries were the massive stone doors. These circular stones, some weighing up to 500 kilograms, could be rolled across corridors to seal off sections of the city. What made them particularly ingenious was their design. They could only be moved from the inside. An attacking force that somehow found an entrance to the city would face these impenetrable barriers, unable to force their way deeper into the complex. The doors could seal off individual levels or sections, creating multiple layers of defense. If invaders breached one level, the inhabitants could retreat to lower levels and seal those entrances as well. The religious and educational spaces within Derinkuyu speak to the importance the builders placed on maintaining their culture and beliefs, even in this underground refuge. Archaeologists identified several rooms that served as churches, decorated with crosses and other Christian symbols. These date from the early Christian period, when followers of the new religion used the underground cities to escape persecution. But there's evidence of even earlier religious use. Some spaces show signs of pre-Christian worship. There are also rooms that appear to have been school spaces where children could be educated even while living beneath the earth. As researchers mapped more of Derinkuyu, they made another remarkable discovery. The city wasn't isolated. Tunnels extended horizontally from it, connecting to other underground cities in the region. These weren't small passages, but substantial tunnels, some large enough for people to walk through, upright others, requiring crawling, but still passable. Through these connections, Derinkuyu was linked to at least 36 other underground settlements in Cappadocia. The nearest major underground city, Kalmakla, lies just 9 kilometers away and is connected to Derinkuyu by one of these tunnels. This network raises profound questions. If these cities were connected, were they built as part of a coordinated plan? Did they function as a unified system with different cities, perhaps specializing in different functions? Or were the connections added later, linking independent settlements? The evidence doesn't provide clear answers, and scholars continue to debate these questions. The question of when Derinkuyu was built has proven challenging to answer definitively. The soft volcanic tuffstone that made excavation relatively easy also makes dating difficult. The rock itself doesn't contain organic material that can be carbon dated. Researchers must rely on artifacts found within the city and on historical records that mention underground refuge in the region. The general consensus among archaeologists is that the city was constructed by the Phrygians, an Indo-European people who dominated in central Anatolia around the 8th century BCE. The Phrygians were known for their skill in working stone, and the scale of Derinkuyu would have been consistent with their capabilities and resources. However, some researchers point to evidence suggesting that the origins might be even older. The Hittites, who ruled a powerful empire in Anatolia from roughly 1600 to 1200 BC, left records that mention underground cities in the region. It's possible that they built the first levels of Derinkuyu, which were then expanded by later civilizations. What we know with more certainty is that Derinkuyu was used and modified over many centuries by different peoples. The Christian symbols in churches date from the Byzantine period, particularly from the 6th to 10th centuries CE, when Christians in the region faced threats from Arab raids. Historical records from this period mention the underground cities as places of refuge. But the cities were clearly much older than the Christian additions. They were being adapted and expanded, not built from scratch. This brings us to perhaps the most intriguing question about Derinkuyu. Why was it built in the first place? What threat was so severe that people would undertake the enormous labor of carving an entire city into solid rock? The most common explanation focuses on defense. Throughout its history, Anatolia has been a crossroads of civilizations and a frequent battleground. Invading armies swept through the region repeatedly. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and others. For the people living in Cappadocia, these invasions represented existential threats. An underground city offered protection that no surface fortification could match. Attackers might burn villages and destroy crops, but they couldn't easily reach people hidden deep underground behind massive stone doors. Yet some researchers question whether defense alone explains the scale and sophistication of Derinkuyu. The city could shelter 20,000 people for months. That level of preparation suggests something more than occasional raids. Some scholars have proposed that the cities were built to protect against a specific, sustained threat, perhaps a particularly aggressive empire or a period of prolonged warfare. Others suggest natural disasters might have played a role. The region is seismically active, and underground spaces might have offered protection from earthquakes. Volcanic activity in the region's past could have made surface living periodically dangerous. What remains clear is that Derinkuyu represents an extraordinary achievement of ancient engineering and a testament to human determination to survive. The people who built it possessed sophisticated knowledge of ventilation, water management, and structural engineering. They organized labor on a massive scale and sustained that effort over what must have been many years. And they created not just a survival shelter, but a place where community life could continue, where people could worship, educate their children, produce food and wine, and maintain their culture, even while living in darkness. Today, only about 10% of Derinkuyu is open to visitors. The deeper levels remain closed, some because they're still being studied, others because they're considered too dangerous or unstable for public access. Archaeologists continue to work at the site, and new discoveries are still being made. Each finding adds to our understanding, but also raises new questions. Derinkuyu stands as a reminder that the ancient world was capable of achievements that still impress us today. It challenges our assumptions about what was possible with ancient technology and organization, and it leaves us with mysteries that may never be fully solved. Questions about who first conceived of building an entire city underground, about what threats they faced, and about what other secrets might still lie hidden beneath the landscape of Cappadocia. We've seen how Derinkuyu was discovered, and the remarkable scale of what lay hidden beneath that small Turkish town. Now let's examine more closely how this underground city actually worked, the engineering principles and practical solutions that allowed thousands of people to live beneath the earth. When archaeologists and engineers first began to study Derinkuyu systematically in the years following its discovery, they approached it not just as a historical site, but as a functioning system. They wanted to understand how air circulated, how water was distributed, how waste was managed, and how the inhabitants organized their daily lives in an environment completely cut off from natural light and the rhythms of the surface world. What they found was a level of sophistication that challenged many assumptions about ancient engineering capabilities. The most critical challenge facing anyone attempting to live underground is air. Without proper ventilation, even a small group of people in an enclosed space will quickly deplete the oxygen and build up dangerous levels of carbon dioxide. In Derinkuyu, with the capacity to shelter 20,000 people, plus livestock, the ventilation requirements would have been enormous. A single miscalculation in the design could have rendered entire sections of the city uninhabitable or even deadly. The builders of Derinkuyu solved this problem through a network of 52 ventilation shafts that penetrated through all 18 levels of the city. These weren't simple holes drilled through rock. They were carefully engineered channels varying in diameter from about 20 to 80 centimeters, positioned strategically throughout the complex to ensure air circulation reached every inhabited space. The main ventilation shaft descends approximately 85 meters from the surface to the lowest levels. Modern analysis has shown that this shaft was positioned to take advantage of natural air pressure differentials. Warm air from the inhabited spaces would naturally rise through some shafts, while cooler air from the surface would descend through others, creating a continuous circulation pattern. The builders understood, whether through observation and experimentation or inherited knowledge, principles of thermodynamics that wouldn't be formally described in physics until the 19th century. What makes the ventilation system even more impressive is its redundancy. The shafts were interconnected at various levels, so that if one became blocked or compromised, air could still reach all areas through alternative routes. Some shafts could be sealed off at different levels, allowing sections of the city to be isolated without cutting off air to other areas. This design shows not just engineering skill, but strategic thinking about how the city might need to function under different circumstances. Engineers who have studied the system note another sophisticated feature: the shafts were designed to be difficult to poison or contaminate from the surface. They didn't run straight down, but followed irregular paths with turns and offsets that would prevent someone from simply pouring toxins down from above. Some shafts had chambers where air would pool briefly before continuing downward, allowing any contaminants to settle out. The builders were thinking not just about providing air, but about defending against specific threats. Water presented another fundamental challenge. The human body requires water constantly, and a population of thousands would need access to substantial quantities every day, not just for drinking, but for cooking, washing, and sanitation. The underground city couldn't rely on surface water sources; those could be controlled or poisoned by enemies. The solution lay in reaching deep underground aquifers. Wells were carved down through the rock to tap into these water sources. The deepest wells in Derinkuyu extend more than 50 meters below the lowest inhabited level. The water from these wells was remarkably pure, filtered naturally through layers of volcanic rock. But accessing water at such depths created its own challenges. How do you lift water up through 50 meters of vertical shaft without modern pumps? The evidence suggests a combination of methods. In some wells, archaeologists have found grooves worn into the stone walls, likely from ropes used to raise and lower buckets over many years. Other wells show evidence of more sophisticated systems, carved channels that allowed water to flow horizontally from the well to collection points on different levels, using gravity and careful grading to control the flow. Some chambers appear to have functioned as cisterns storing water pumped or carried from the wells, so that inhabitants wouldn't need to make the journey to the well itself for every need. The water distribution system included drainage as well. Channels carved into the floors of corridors, and rooms directed used water away from living spaces. These drainage channels all sloped downward, eventually leading to collection points on the lowest levels where the water could seep back into the earth. The system was designed to prevent standing water, which could have become stagnant and disease-ridden in the enclosed environment. Temperature control in Derinkuyu was in some ways simpler than in surface dwellings. The earth itself provided insulation. Regardless of the season or weather on the surface, the temperature in the underground city remained relatively constant, hovering around 14 degrees Celsius year-round. This is cool but not uncomfortably cold, and the inhabitants would have adapted their clothing accordingly. The stable temperature also meant that food stored in the city would remain preserved far longer than on the surface, where seasonal temperature swings would cause spoilage. However, with thousands of people and animals living in close quarters, body heat would have been a factor. The ventilation system helped moderate this, carrying away excess heat along with stale air. In areas where people gathered in large numbers, the communal halls and churches, the ceilings were carved higher, allowing hot air to rise away from the occupied space. The stone doors that could seal off different sections of the city represent another remarkable feat of engineering. These weren't hinged doors like those we're familiar with. Instead, they were massive circular stones shaped like enormous wheels that rolled across openings in the corridors. The largest of these doors measured up to 1.5 meters in diameter and weighed approximately 500 kilograms. Each door was carved to fit precisely into a groove in the corridor wall. When not in use, the door would rest in a carved recess to the side of the passage, allowing people to move freely. When danger threatened, the door could be rolled across the corridor opening. The fit was so precise that the door would seal the passage almost airtight. A small hole in the center of each door allowed defenders to observe what was happening on the other side, and in some cases to use spears or other weapons against anyone attempting to force entry. The genius of the design lay in how the doors were moved. They could only be rolled into the closed position, from the inside, from the deeper, more protected side of the passage. An attacker who somehow penetrated to one of these doors would find it impossible to open. The door's weight and the precision of its fit meant that even a large group of men couldn't force it open by pushing. The only way through would be to somehow break the stone itself, a task that would take hours or days and would alert the defenders to the attempt. The placement of these doors throughout the city created a layered defense. An invader who breached the upper levels would find their progress blocked by the first set of doors. Even if they somehow got past those, they would encounter more doors at each level with the defenders retreating deeper and sealing each passage behind them. The city could be defended by a relatively small number of people because the attackers would face these choke points at every turn. Living spaces in Derinkuyu were organized with careful attention to function and efficiency. The upper levels closest to the surface contained the most frequently used areas: living quarters, communal kitchens, and storage for everyday supplies. These areas had the best access to ventilation and were easiest to reach from the surface entrances during times of peace, when people might move between the underground city and surface dwellings. The middle levels housed more specialized functions. Here archaeologists found the wine and oil presses facilities that required substantial space and would have been used seasonally or periodically rather than daily. There were also larger storage chambers for long-term food supplies positioned at depths where the temperature was most stable. Stables for livestock were located on these middle levels as well in areas with particularly good ventilation to handle the additional air quality challenges that animals would create. The deepest levels appear to have been reserved for the most critical functions and for use during the most desperate circumstances. These included secure storage for the most valuable supplies, protected water sources, and spaces that could serve as final refuges if all the upper levels were compromised. Some of the deepest chambers show evidence of having been meeting rooms or command centers, places where leaders could gather to make decisions, while protected by all the defensive layers above them. The organization of space also reflected social structure. Some rooms were clearly private family quarters, while others were communal. The size and location of rooms varied, suggesting that not everyone had equal status. Some families or individuals occupied larger, better positioned spaces. Yet the overall design shows a concern for the community as a whole. The ventilation system served all areas equally. Water access was distributed throughout the levels. The defensive doors protected everyone, not just an elite. Lighting in the underground city came entirely from oil lamps. Niches carved into walls throughout the complex held these lamps years, and the soot stains that remain on ceilings above them testify to centuries of use. The amount of oil required to light even a portion of the city would have been substantial, making oil production and storage critical functions. The presence of oil presses within the city makes sense in this context. The inhabitants needed to be self-sufficient in producing this essential resource. The churches and religious spaces within Derinkuyu reveal another aspect of how life was organized underground. These weren't afterthoughts or simple caves. They were carefully carved spaces with architectural features, arched ceilings, carved altars, and decorated walls. The effort invested in creating these spaces tells us that the builders and inhabitants viewed the underground city not as a temporary emergency shelter, but as a place where full community life, including religious practice, would continue. Schools and educational spaces show similar intentionality. Even in a crisis, even while living beneath the earth, the community prioritized the education of children. This long-term thinking, the recognition that life might continue underground for extended periods, potentially for generations, shaped many of the design decisions throughout the city. What emerges from studying Derinkuyu's architecture is a picture of a society that thought systematically about survival. They didn't simply dig caves and hope for the best. They analyzed the challenges of underground living and developed sophisticated solutions. They built redundancy into critical systems. They planned for different scenarios and different levels of threat. And they created not just a survival shelter, but a functioning city where community life could continue. Modern engineers who study Derinkuyu often express admiration for the elegance of its solutions. With only hand tools and human labor, the builders created systems that rival modern engineering in their effectiveness. The ventilation system works as well today as it did centuries ago. The water sources remain pure. The defensive doors, though ancient, still function. This wasn't primitive technology. It was appropriate technology perfectly suited to its purpose and executed with remarkable skill. The architecture of Derinkuyu stands as testament to what human ingenuity can achieve when survival is at stake. It shows us that ancient peoples were capable of complex planning, sophisticated engineering, and long-term thinking. And it reminds us that the challenges of creating livable spaces in hostile environments, whether underground cities in ancient Anatolia or space stations in orbit, require the same fundamental approach: careful analysis, systematic problem-solving, and attention to the details that make the difference between mere survival and sustainable life. We've explored the physical structure of Derinkuyu and marveled at its engineering. But understanding the architecture only takes us so far. The more profound questions remain: who built this extraordinary city, and why did they need it? These questions have occupied archaeologists and historians since the discovery of Derinkuyu in 1963. The answers, as we'll see, are complex and in some cases still debated. What we're dealing with isn't a single construction project by one civilization, but rather a site that was used, modified, and expanded by multiple cultures over thousands of years. Each group left its mark, adding layers of history that archaeologists must carefully separate and interpret. Let's begin with what we can establish with reasonable certainty. The region of Cappadocia has been inhabited for millennia. and its unique geology, soft volcanic tuffstone that's relatively easy to carve but hardens when exposed to air, made it ideal for underground construction. The earliest evidence of human presence in the area dates back to the Paleolithic period, though there's no indication that those early inhabitants created anything like Derinkuyu. The first civilization we can connect with some confidence to underground construction in Cappadocia is the Hittites. This powerful Bronze Age empire dominated Anatolia from approximately 1600 to 1200 BCE. Hittite texts deciphered in the 20th century make references to underground refuges in the region. One text mentions the land of the underground houses, which many scholars believe refers to Cappadocia. However, we must be careful not to overstate what this tells us. The Hittites may have built some underground structures, or they may have simply been aware of existing ones. The archaeological evidence from Derinkuyu itself doesn't provide clear proof of Hittite construction. What we can say is that the techniques used in Derinkuyu's construction are consistent with Bronze Age capabilities. The tools required, bronze or iron picks, chisels, and hammers, were available to civilizations in the region from at least 2000 BCE onward. The scale of the project would have required organized labor and central authority, both of which the Hittites certainly possessed. But the absence of distinctly Hittite artifacts or inscriptions in Derinkuyu leaves this connection suggestive rather than definitive. The civilization most commonly credited with Derinkuyu's construction is the Phrygians. These Indo-European people migrated into Anatolia around 1200 BCE, filling the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Hittite Empire. The Phrygians established a kingdom centered in what is now central Turkey, with their capital at Gordion. They were known for their skill in metalworking and stone carving, and they left behind impressive monuments, including rock-cut tombs and facades that demonstrate sophisticated stoneworking techniques. The dating of artifacts found within Derinkuyu points most strongly to the Phrygian period, roughly the 8th to 7th centuries BCE. Pottery fragments, tools, and other objects from this era have been discovered throughout the underground city. The style of some carved architectural elements also matches Phrygian work found at other sites in the region. Based on this evidence, most archaeologists conclude that if the Phrygians didn't initiate the construction of Derinkuyu, they at least undertook major expansions and improvements during their occupation of the area. But why would the Phrygians need such an extensive underground refuge? To answer this, we need to understand the geopolitical situation of the time. The Phrygian kingdom existed in a dangerous neighborhood. To the east lay the Assyrian Empire, one of the most militarily powerful states of the ancient world. Assyrian records from the 8th century BCE document multiple campaigns into Anatolia, and the Assyrians were known for their brutal treatment of conquered peoples. For the Phrygians, the threat of Assyrian invasion was very real. Around 696 BCE, that threat materialized. The Cimmerians, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppes, swept into Anatolia, possibly fleeing pressure from the Scythians further north. They destroyed the Phrygian capital at Gordion and effectively ended Phrygian power in the region. Could Derinkuyu have served as a refuge during these invasions? It's certainly possible. The city's capacity to shelter 20,000 people for extended periods would have made it an invaluable asset during times of warfare. Following the Phrygian period, Cappadocia came under the control of various powers, the Lydians, the Persians, and eventually Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire. After Alexander's death, the region became part of the Hellenistic world, and later, the Roman Empire. Throughout these transitions, the underground cities of Cappadocia continued to be used and modified. Each successive culture adapted the spaces to their needs, adding their own architectural elements and artifacts. The most visible layer of occupation in Derinkuyu today dates from the Byzantine period, particularly from the 6th to 10th centuries CE. This is when Christianity had become the dominant religion in the region, and it's from this period that we find the most extensive modifications to the underground city. The churches carved into various levels of Derinkuyu, decorated with crosses and Christian symbols, date from this era. Some of these religious spaces show remarkable artistry, with carved columns, arched ceilings, and niches for icons. Why did Byzantine Christians need underground refuges? The answer lies in the waves of Arab invasions that swept through Anatolia, beginning in the 7th century CE. Following the rapid expansion of Islam after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, Arab armies conquered vast territories, including much of the Byzantine Empire's eastern provinces. Cappadocia became a frontier zone, subject to repeated raids and military campaigns. Historical sources from this period provide direct evidence of the underground cities being used as refuges. Byzantine chronicles mention Christians retreating into the caves during Arab raids. The 10th century Byzantine emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus wrote about the underground cities of Cappadocia in his work De Administrando Imperio, describing them as places where local populations could shelter during invasions. The archaeological evidence supports this historical record. Many of the defensive features in Derinkuyu, particularly the rolling stone doors, show signs of use and repair from the Byzantine period. The storage chambers contain remnants of supplies that date from this era. The ventilation systems show modifications that improve their efficiency, suggesting that the cities were being actively maintained and improved. But the Byzantine period also reveals something else about life in Derinkuyu. These weren't just emergency shelters used for a few days or weeks during immediate danger. Some families appear to have lived underground for extended periods, perhaps months or even years. The presence of schools, churches, and communal spaces designed for regular use suggests a semi-permanent underground community. This raises intriguing questions about the psychological and social dynamics of such an existence. Living underground for extended periods would have required significant adaptation. The absence of natural light would have disrupted normal circadian rhythms. The constant temperature, while stable, would have eliminated the seasonal variations that normally mark the passage of time. The enclosed spaces and constant proximity to others would have created social pressures unknown in surface communities. Yet the evidence suggests that communities managed to maintain their social structures, religious practices, and educational systems, even in these challenging conditions. One theory that has gained attention in recent years suggests that the underground cities served not just as military refuge but also as religious sanctuaries. During periods of persecution, whether by Roman authorities in the early Christian period or by various invaders, later Christians may have used the underground cities as places where they could practice their faith freely away from hostile eyes. The number and quality of the religious spaces in Derinkuyu lend some support to this theory. These weren't hastily carved emergency shelters, but carefully designed worship spaces that would have taken considerable time and effort to create. Some scholars have proposed more controversial theories about Derinkuyu's origins and purpose. A few have suggested that the cities might have been built to protect against natural disasters rather than human enemies. The Cappadocia region has experienced volcanic activity in the past, and some researchers have speculated that ancient peoples might have retreated underground during periods of volcanic eruption or other environmental catastrophes. However, this theory has less support among mainstream archaeologists who point out that the defensive features of the cities, particularly the one-way stone doors, make sense only in the context of human threats. Another question that continues to intrigue researchers is the relationship between Derinkuyu and the other underground cities in the region. We know that tunnels connected many of these cities, creating a vast underground network. Were these cities built as part of a coordinated defensive system? Did they function independently, or was there some form of central authority coordinating their use? The evidence doesn't provide clear answers. What we can say is that the existence of this network suggests a high level of organization and cooperation among the communities of Cappadocia. Building and maintaining such an extensive system would have required sustained effort over many generations. It would have needed coordination between different settlements, shared knowledge of engineering techniques, and probably some form of central planning, or at least common understanding of defensive strategy. The question of who exactly lived in Derinkuyu at different periods remains partially unanswered. We know that various civilizations used the city, but we know less about the specific communities, the families, the social structures, the daily lives of ordinary people who called this underground space home, at least temporarily. The archaeological record gives us artifacts and architectural features, but it's less forthcoming about the human stories behind them. What we do know is that the people who used Derinkuyu across all the different periods of its occupation shared certain characteristics. They were organized enough to maintain complex systems. They valued community survival over individual comfort. They were willing to endure the challenges of underground life to protect themselves and their families. They maintained their cultural and religious identities, even in the most adverse circumstances. And they possessed the foresight to prepare for threats before those threats materialized, to invest enormous labor in creating refuges they hoped they might never need to use. The story of Derinkuyu's inhabitants is ultimately a story about human resilience and adaptability. Faced with recurring threats, whether from Assyrian armies, Sumerian raiders, Persian conquerors, or Arab invasions, the people of Cappadocia found a way to survive. They didn't simply flee or submit. They created an alternative, a place where life could continue, even when the surface world became too dangerous. And they maintained these refuges across centuries, each generation adding to and improving what previous generations had built. Today, as we walk through the illuminated corridors of Derinkuyu, it's easy to see it as simply an archaeological curiosity, a tourist attraction. But if we pause and consider what this place represents, the accumulated effort of countless individuals across millennia, the ingenuity required to solve unprecedented challenges, the determination to preserve community and culture against overwhelming odds, we begin to understand that Derinkuyu is more than just an underground city. It's a testament to the human will to survive and to the lengths people will go to protect what matters most to them. We focused our attention on Derinkuyu, examining its structure and the people who built and used it. But Derinkuyu, remarkable as it is, represents only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Beneath the landscape of Cappadocia lies an entire network of underground cities and connecting tunnels, a subterranean world whose full extent remains unknown even today. The discovery of this network didn't happen all at once. After Derinkuyu came to light in 1963, archaeologists and local authorities began to pay closer attention to similar sites throughout the region. What they found was astonishing. Underground cities weren't rare in Cappadocia, they were common. Within a few years of Derinkuyu's discovery, dozens of other underground settlements had been identified. As of today, more than 200 underground cities have been documented in the Cappadocia region, though only a fraction of these have been thoroughly explored and mapped. The second largest underground city discovered so far is Kaymakla, located approximately 9 kilometers north of Derinkuyu. Kaymakla is smaller than Derinkuyu. It extends only 8 levels deep compared to Derinkuyu's 18, but it's more extensively excavated and perhaps better preserved in some areas. The layout differs somewhat from Derinkuyu, with narrower passages and lower ceilings in many sections, suggesting it may have been designed with slightly different priorities, or by people with different building traditions. When archaeologists explored Kaymakla thoroughly, they made a remarkable discovery. A tunnel extended from the lower levels of the city, running roughly in the direction of Derinkuyu. This tunnel carved through solid rock was large enough for a person to walk through in a crouched position, though in some sections it opened up to allow upright passage. The tunnel ran for approximately 9 kilometers underground, connecting the two cities. This wasn't a natural cave formation that had been adapted, it was entirely artificial, carved with the same deliberate purpose as the cities themselves. The existence of this tunnel raised immediate questions. Why connect the cities? What purpose would such a connection serve? The most obvious answer relates to defense and communication. If one city came under attack or its entrances were compromised, inhabitants could potentially escape through the tunnel to the other city. The connection would also allow the two communities to share resources, coordinate defensive strategies, and maintain contact even when surface travel was dangerous. But the Derinkuyu Kaymakla tunnel proved to be just the beginning. As exploration continued, archaeologists discovered that many of the underground cities in Cappadocia were connected by similar tunnels. Some tunnels were short linking cities only a few kilometers apart. Others extended for much greater distances. The tunnels varied in size and quality. Some were carefully carved with relatively smooth walls and floors, while others were rougher, perhaps excavated more hastily, or by communities with fewer resources. Mapping this underground network has proven to be an enormous challenge. Many tunnels have collapsed over the centuries. Others have been deliberately sealed either by ancient inhabitants for defensive reasons or by more recent occupants who wanted to prevent unauthorized access. Some tunnels run beneath modern towns and cities, making excavation impossible without disrupting contemporary life. And the sheer scale of the network means that even with modern surveying equipment, archaeologists have been able to map only a portion of what exists. What we do know is that the network is extensive. Researchers have identified connections between at least 36 different underground settlements. Some archaeologists believe the actual number of connected sites may be much higher, perhaps over 100. If this is true, then beneath Cappadocia lies one of the most extensive underground networks ever created by human hands, rivaling or exceeding the famous catacombs of Rome or Paris in total length. The tunnels themselves reveal interesting details about how they were constructed and used. Most were carved at a depth of between 10 and 30 meters below the surface, deep enough to be secure and hidden, but not so deep as to make excavation impossibly difficult. The tunnels generally followed the most direct route between cities, but they also took advantage of the geology, following layers of softer rock when possible, and avoiding areas where harder stone or underground water would have made digging more difficult. In many tunnels, archaeologists have found evidence of way stations, small chambers carved out at intervals along the route. These spaces would have provided places to rest during what must have been exhausting journeys through the dark, confined passages. Some way stations show signs of having held oil lamps, and a few contain carved benches or niches that might have held supplies. The presence of these way stations suggests that the tunnels were used regularly, not just in emergencies, and that the ancient inhabitants had developed systems for making underground travel as manageable as possible. The width and height of the tunnels varied considerably. Some were large enough for people to walk through, upright, perhaps even wide enough for two people to pass each other. These larger tunnels might have been main routes used frequently for moving people and supplies between cities. Other tunnels were much smaller, requiring travelers to crawl or move in a crouched position. These might have been escape routes dug quickly during times of danger, or perhaps they were older tunnels that had partially collapsed over time. One particularly intriguing discovery came in the early 2000s when researchers using ground-penetrating radar identified what appeared to be a major tunnel running beneath the modern town of Nevşehir, the largest city in the Cappadocia region. This tunnel seemed to connect several known underground cities, but its size was unusual, significantly larger than most other tunnels that had been explored. Further investigation suggested that this might have been a main artery in the underground network, a primary route that smaller tunnels branched off from. This discovery led to another remarkable find. In 2013, during construction work in Nevşehir, workers uncovered what appeared to be a massive underground complex that had been completely unknown to archaeologists. Initial surveys suggested this newly discovered site might be even larger than Derinkuyu, with an estimated area of approximately 460,000 square meters spread across multiple levels. The site, which has been named Nevşehir Underground City, is still being excavated and studied, but early findings indicate it was connected to the broader network of underground cities in the region. The Nevşehir discovery highlights an important point. Despite decades of archaeological work in Cappadocia, we're still finding major sites. The underground network is so extensive and so much of it lies beneath modern development that we may never know its full extent. There could be other large underground cities still waiting to be discovered, hidden beneath towns, fields, or vineyards. The question of how this network was created, whether it was the result of coordinated planning or developed more organically over time, remains debated among scholars. Some researchers argue that the network must have been planned, at least in part. The fact that tunnels connect cities in logical patterns, creating what amounts to an underground transportation system, suggests some level of central coordination. The similarity in construction techniques across different sites also points to shared knowledge and possibly shared labor forces. Other scholars are more cautious. They point out that the underground cities were built and modified over many centuries by different civilizations. What looks like a planned network might actually be the accumulated result of many independent decisions. A city might dig a tunnel to a neighboring settlement for mutual defense. Later, that neighboring settlement might dig a tunnel to a third city. Over time, these individual connections would create a network without anyone having planned the overall system. The truth probably lies somewhere between these positions. It's likely that some connections were planned and coordinated, while others developed more spontaneously. Different periods might have seen different approaches. During times of strong central authority under the Phrygians, or later the Byzantines, there might have been coordinated efforts to expand and improve the network. During more fragmented periods, individual communities might have acted independently. What's clear is that maintaining this network would have required sustained effort. Tunnels would need regular inspection and repair. Collapsed sections would need to be cleared or bypassed. Way stations would need to be stocked with supplies. This maintenance work implies organization and cooperation between different underground cities. Even if the network wasn't centrally planned, it was certainly centrally maintained, at least during periods when it was actively used. The strategic value of such a network would have been considerable. An invading army might capture one or two underground cities, but the network would allow inhabitants of other cities to monitor the situation, coordinate responses, and potentially mount rescue operations. Supplies could be moved between cities through the tunnels, allowing communities to share resources and support each other during sieges. Information could travel through the network faster than it could on the surface, giving the underground communities an intelligence advantage. But the network also raises questions about daily life in ancient Cappadocia. Were the underground cities permanently inhabited, or were they primarily refugees used during times of danger? The evidence suggests both patterns existed at different times and in different places. Some cities show signs of continuous habitation, wear patterns on floors and stairs, extensive food storage facilities, and permanent religious and educational spaces. Others appear to have been used more sporadically, maintained in readiness, but occupied only during emergencies. The tunnels connecting the cities would have been crucial for whichever pattern of use prevailed. If cities were permanently inhabited, the tunnels would have facilitated trade, social interaction, and cultural exchange between underground communities. If cities were primarily refugees, the tunnels would have been essential for coordinating defensive strategies and sharing warnings about approaching threats. Modern visitors to Cappadocia can explore small sections of this underground network. In Derinkuyu and Kemakla, tourists can walk through some of the connecting tunnels, experiencing firsthand the claustrophobic passages that ancient inhabitants would have navigated by lamplight. But these accessible sections represent only a tiny fraction of the total network. Most of the tunnels remain closed to the public, either because they're still being studied, because they're considered unsafe, or because they lie beneath private property or modern development. The underground network of Cappadocia stands as one of the most ambitious construction projects of the ancient world. In terms of total volume of rock removed, it may rival the pyramids of Egypt. But unlike the pyramids, which were built to glorify rulers and demonstrate power, the underground cities were built for survival. They represent a different kind of human achievement, not monuments to individual greatness, but collective efforts to ensure community survival. The network also reminds us that ancient peoples were capable of thinking on a grand scale, of undertaking projects that would span generations, and of creating infrastructure systems that served entire regions rather than single communities. The underground cities of Cappadocia weren't isolated fortresses. They were nodes in a network, parts of a larger defensive and social system that stretched across the landscape. Today, as archaeologists continue to explore and map the underground network, new discoveries continue to emerge. Each new tunnel discovered, each new connection identified, adds to our understanding of how this remarkable system functioned. But it also adds to the mystery. The more we learn about the network, the more we realize how much remains unknown. Beneath the fields and towns of modern Cappadocia, there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered. Still tunnels that haven't been explored. Still cities that haven't been found. The underground world of Cappadocia continues to guard its mysteries, revealing them slowly, one discovery at a time. From the ancient underground cities of Turkey, we now travel westward to France, to another remarkable subterranean world. But where Derinkuyu was built for the living, the underground spaces of Paris were transformed into a realm of the dead. Beneath the streets of one of Europe's most beautiful cities lies what may be the world's largest ossuary, a repository holding the remains of more than 6 million people. The story of the Paris Catacombs begins not with death, but with construction. For centuries, the stone used to build Paris came from beneath Paris itself. Beginning in Roman times and continuing through the medieval period and beyond, workers quarried limestone from underground deposits. These weren't deep mines in the conventional sense. The limestone lay relatively close to the surface, and miners carved out vast networks of tunnels and chambers as they extracted the stone. By the 18th century, approximately 300 kilometers of these old quarry tunnels snaked beneath the city. For most of Paris's history, these tunnels were simply abandoned once the stone had been removed. They lay forgotten beneath the growing city, their entrances sealed or built over. The quarries had served their purpose, and few people gave much thought to the empty spaces they'd left behind. But by the late 1700s, these forgotten tunnels would be called upon to solve a crisis that threatened the health and well-being of everyone living in Paris. The crisis centered on the city's cemeteries. For 1,000 years, Parisians had buried their dead in churchyards and cemeteries within the city limits. The largest and oldest of these was the Cimetière des Innocents, located in the heart of Paris near the Central Market. This cemetery had been in continuous use since the medieval period, and by the 18th century it had become grotesquely overcrowded. The problem wasn't simply that the cemetery was full. Bodies had been buried in layers, one atop another, for so many centuries that the ground level had risen several meters above the surrounding streets. The soil was saturated with decomposing human remains. During heavy rains, the cemetery would flood, and the runoff would carry human remains into the streets and cellars of nearby buildings. The smell was overwhelming, particularly in summer. Residents of the neighborhood complained constantly, but the practice continued. There was simply nowhere else to bury the dead. The situation reached a crisis point in the spring of 1780. The wall of a building adjacent to the cemetery collapsed, and the basement was flooded with decomposing bodies and contaminated soil. The incident finally forced authorities to act. King Louis XVI's administration declared that the Cimetière des Innocents and several other overcrowded cemeteries within Paris must be closed. But this decision created a new problem: what to do with the countless remains already buried there. The solution came from an unexpected source. Charles Axel Guillaumeau, the Inspector General of Quarries, had been working to address another problem: the structural instability of the old quarry tunnels beneath Paris. Several neighborhoods had experienced sinkholes and building collapses as ancient tunnels gave way. Guillaumeau had been surveying and reinforcing these tunnels, and in the process he'd become intimately familiar with the vast underground spaces beneath the city. Guillaumeau proposed using the old quarries as an ossuary. The tunnels were dry stable once properly reinforced and offered enormous capacity. They were also already beneath the city, eliminating the need to transport remains long distances. In 1785, the decision was made to proceed with this unprecedented project. The old Tombissoir quarries, located in what was then the outskirts of Paris, would be consecrated as an ossuary and prepared to receive the remains from the closed cemeteries. The work of transferring the bones began in April 1786. It was conducted with solemnity and respect, despite the massive scale of the undertaking. Each evening, after dark, to minimize disruption and maintain dignity, processions of black-draped carts would make their way through the streets of Paris. Priests accompanied the carts, conducting prayers and blessings. At the quarry entrance, the remains were carefully lowered into the tunnels below. The task was enormous. The Cimetière des Innocents alone contained the remains of perhaps 2 million people accumulated over nearly 1,000 years. Workers had to carefully exhume these remains, sort bones from soil, and transport them to the ossuary. The initial phase of this work took more than 2 years, continuing until 1788. But the project would ultimately span decades, as remains from other closed cemeteries were gradually transferred to the catacombs. Once the bones arrived in the tunnels, they needed to be arranged and stored. This is where the catacombs began to take on their distinctive character. Rather than simply piling bones in heaps, the workers, under Guillaumeau's direction, and later that of his successor, Louis-Étienne Héricard de Thury, arranged them with care and even artistry. Long bones, primarily femurs, and tibias were stacked to form walls along the tunnel passages. These walls of bones, often several meters high, created a stable structure that also maximized the use of space. Skulls were arranged in rows, creating striking visual patterns. In some sections, bones were arranged to form decorative elements, crosses, hearts, and other symbols. Plaques were installed at intervals identifying which cemetery the bones had come from, and sometimes including inscriptions about death and mortality. Héricard de Thury, who took over management of the ossuary in 1809, was particularly interested in creating what he called a municipal sepulchre that would be both functional and meaningful. He designed the entrance to include an inscription that has become famous: "Arrête, c'est ici l'empire de la mort." Stop, this is the empire of death. He added other inscriptions throughout the catacombs, many drawn from classical literature and religious texts, all reflecting on mortality and the transience of earthly life. The catacombs officially opened to the public in 1809, though access was limited and required special permission. Even in the early 19th century, there was a fascination with this underground realm of the dead. Visitors would descend into the tunnels by lamplight, walking through passages lined with the bones of countless Parisians from centuries past. The experience was designed to be contemplative, even educational, a meditation on death and the equality it brings to all people, regardless of their status in life. The arrangement of bones in the catacombs continued throughout the 19th century. As more cemeteries were closed and Paris expanded, additional remains were transferred to the underground ossuary. By the time the major transfers ended in the mid-1800s, the catacombs held the remains of approximately 6 million people. To put this in perspective, this is more than twice the current population of Paris proper. The catacombs occupy only a small portion of the old quarry tunnels beneath Paris. The ossuary itself extends for roughly 2 kilometers of tunnels, though only about 1.5 kilometers are open to the public today. The rest of the tunnel network, the vast majority of those 300 kilometers of underground passages, remains closed, forming a dark labyrinth beneath the city that few people ever see. This larger network has its own history and its own inhabitants of a sort. During World War II, both the French resistance and the German occupation forces used sections of the tunnels. The resistance established hidden command posts and storage areas in the catacombs. The Germans built bunkers in some sections, including a fortified shelter beneath the Les Montagnes that could house hundreds of soldiers. Evidence of these wartime uses can still be found in some areas of the tunnels. In more recent decades, the unauthorized sections of the catacombs have attracted a subculture of urban explorers known as cataphiles. These individuals, often young Parisians, enter the tunnels through secret entrances and spend hours or even days exploring the underground network. They've created an entire hidden world down there, art galleries, meeting spaces, even underground parties. The cataphiles have their own maps, more detailed in some ways than official ones, showing passages and chambers unknown to authorities. The Paris police maintain a special unit, the cataphiles, dedicated to patrolling the tunnels and preventing unauthorized access. But the network is so vast that complete control is impossible. The cataphiles continue their explorations, and occasionally their activities make news, such as in 2004, when police discovered a fully equipped movie theater in a hidden chamber, complete with a screen, projection equipment, seating, and a bar. When police returned with equipment to dismantle it, they found everything had been removed, and a note left behind, warning them not to try to find those responsible. But let's return to the official catacombs, the ossuary, that visitors can tour today. Walking through these passages is a profound experience. The walls of bones stretch into the darkness beyond the reach of the lighting. Skulls stare out from their arrangements, empty eye sockets creating an unsettling sense of being watched. The air is cool and slightly damp with a distinctive smell, not unpleasant, but distinctly different from the air above ground. The inscriptions placed throughout the catacombs add to the contemplative atmosphere. Many are in Latin or French, reflecting on the nature of death and the brevity of life. One reads, "Happy is he who has the hour of his death always before his eyes and who prepares himself for it every day." Another states simply, "Think in the morning that you may not last until evening, and in the evening that you may not last until morning." These messages weren't meant to be morbid or frightening. Rather, they reflected a philosophical tradition, common in the 18th and 19th centuries, of using contemplation of death as a way to appreciate life and maintain perspective on what truly matters. The catacombs were designed as a place of reflection, where visitors would be confronted with the ultimate fate that awaits all humans, regardless of wealth, power, or achievement. The bones themselves tell stories, though not in ways that can be easily read. Among the millions of remains are those of people from all walks of life, nobles and peasants, merchants and laborers, children and elderly. The catacombs contain the bones of people who lived through the medieval period, the Renaissance, the age of Louis XIV, and the French Revolution. Some may have died in the plague epidemics that periodically swept through Paris. Others may have been victims of violence during the religious wars or the Revolution. Most simply lived ordinary lives and died ordinary deaths, and now rest anonymously among millions of others. The Paris Catacombs represent a unique solution to a practical problem: what to do when a city runs out of space to bury its dead. But they also represent something more, a massive monument to mortality itself, a place where the reality of death cannot be ignored or prettified. In a city famous for its beauty, its art, and its celebration of life, the catacombs provide a counterpoint, a reminder that all beauty fades, all lives end, and all of us will one day join the countless generations that have gone before. We've explored the origins of the Paris Catacombs and understood why they came to exist. Now let's examine more closely how these underground spaces were transformed from abandoned quarries into what became in essence a vast underground monument, a carefully designed space where death itself became a form of architecture. When the first cartloads of bones arrived at the old Tombissoir quarries in 1786, the workers faced a challenge that had no precedent. How does one respectfully arrange the remains of millions of people in a way that honors their memory while making practical use of limited space? The solution they developed would transform these tunnels into something unique in human history, neither quite a cemetery nor quite a museum, but something in between. The initial approach was relatively straightforward. Bones were sorted by type and size, then stacked along the walls of the tunnels. Long bones, femurs, tibias, humeri, formed the basic structure. These bones, being relatively uniform in size and shape, could be stacked horizontally to create stable walls. The workers laid them perpendicular to the tunnel walls, with the ends facing outward, creating a pattern that was both structurally sound and visually distinctive. But even in these early arrangements, there was attention to aesthetics. Skulls were placed at regular intervals among the long bones, breaking up the monotony and creating visual focal points. The effect was striking walls of pale bone stretching into the darkness, punctuated by the hollow-eyed stares of countless skulls. It was macabre, certainly, but also strangely beautiful in its symmetry and order. As the work continued, the arrangements became more elaborate. Workers began creating decorative patterns with the bones. Skulls were arranged in rows or geometric patterns, circles, crosses, hearts. In some sections, bones were used to create pillars or columns, providing structural support while also serving as artistic elements. The long bones were sometimes arranged in alternating directions, creating herringbone or chevron patterns that added visual interest to the walls. This wasn't random decoration. The workers who arranged these bones were following a tradition that had existed in Europe for centuries, the tradition of ossuaries. In many European countries, particularly in areas where space was limited, it was common practice to exhume bones from graves after a certain period and store them in special buildings or rooms called ossuaries or charnel houses. These spaces often featured decorative arrangements of bones, and some became pilgrimage sites or tourist attractions. The most famous example of this tradition is probably the Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, where bones are arranged to form chandeliers, coats of arms, and other elaborate decorations. The Paris Catacombs drew on this tradition, but adapted it to a much larger scale. Where most ossuaries contained the remains of hundreds or perhaps thousands of people, the Paris Catacomb would hold millions. Louis-Étienne Héricard de Toury, who became Inspector General of Quarries, in 1809 brought a new vision to the catacombs. Héricard de Thury was not just an engineer but also an intellectual with interests in history, philosophy, and art. He saw the catacombs as an opportunity to create something more than just a storage space for bones. He wanted to create a meaningful memorial, a place that would inspire reflection on mortality and the human condition. Under Héricard de Thury's direction, the catacombs took on their current character. He designed the official entrance which visitors still use today. The entrance includes a long, spiral staircase descending 20 meters below street level. The descent itself is part of the experience, a gradual transition from the world of the living to the realm of the dead. At the bottom of the stairs, visitors pass through a doorway bearing the famous inscription, Arrêtez ici, l'Empire de la Mort. Beyond this threshold, Héricard de Thury created what he called a municipal sepulchre, a public space dedicated to remembering the dead. He added numerous inscriptions throughout the tunnels, carefully selecting texts that he felt would inspire appropriate contemplation. Many were drawn from classical sources, Latin poets and philosophers who had written about death and mortality. Others came from religious texts or from more contemporary writers. One inscription taken from the Roman poet Horace reads, Quis scit annadiciant odiernae crastina summae tempora de superi, which translates roughly as, who knows if the gods above will add tomorrow to today's sum. Another from a French poet states, Il semble que dans ce séjour, le silence même se repose. It seems that in this dwelling, silence itself rests. These inscriptions weren't merely decorative. They were carefully placed at specific points along the route through the catacombs designed to guide visitors' thoughts and emotions as they progressed through the space. Early in the route, the inscriptions focus on the universality of death, the idea that all people, regardless of status, meet the same end. Deeper in the catacombs, the texts become more philosophical, encouraging visitors to reflect on how awareness of mortality should influence how we live. Héricard de Thury also added plaques identifying the sources of the bones in different sections. These plaques, made of stone and mounted on the walls, indicate which cemetery the remains came from and sometimes provide dates. For example, one plaque reads, Ossements du cimetière Saint-Nicolas-des-Champs, déposés en 1804. Bones from the cemetery of Saint-Nicolas-des-Champs, deposited in 1804. These markers serve both a practical and a memorial function. They provide historical information, but they also ensure that the bones aren't completely anonymous. There's at least some record of where these people were originally buried. The physical arrangement of the bones also evolved under Héricard de Thury's supervision. He encouraged workers to create more elaborate patterns and structures. In some areas, bones were arranged to form barrel vaults, curved ceiling structures made entirely of bones. These vaults demonstrated both artistic vision and engineering skill, as the bones had to be carefully placed to create a stable arch. In other sections, workers created what are essentially bone sculptures. One of the most famous is the Barrel of Passion, a cylindrical structure made of the bones arranged in a spiral pattern topped with a cross. Another notable feature is the Cecellum, a small chapel-like space where bones are arranged with particular care and religious symbols are prominently displayed. These special areas serve as focal points within the larger ossuary places where visitors naturally pause and reflect. The lighting in the catacombs, both historically and today, plays a crucial role in how the space is experienced. In Héricard de Thury's time, visitors would have toured by lamplight or candlelight. The flickering, moving shadows would have made the experience even more dramatic and unsettling. Skulls would seem to move in the shifting light. The walls of bones would appear to extend infinitely into the darkness. Modern lighting is more stable, but it's still carefully designed to create the atmosphere. The lights are dim and positioned to create dramatic shadows. In many areas, the lighting comes from below or from angles that create an otherworldly effect. The goal is not to make the space comfortable or familiar, but to maintain a sense of mystery and solemnity. The temperature and humidity in the catacombs remain constant year-round, approximately 14 degrees Celsius, with relatively high humidity. This stable environment has helped preserve the bones remarkably well. Unlike remains buried in soil, which gradually decompose and disintegrate, the bones in the catacombs have been protected from the elements. The cool, damp air prevents them from becoming brittle and crumbling. As a result, bones that were placed in the catacombs more than 200 years ago remain in much the same condition as when they were first arranged. The acoustics of the catacombs add another dimension to the experience. The stone tunnels create unique sound properties. Voices echo in strange ways, sometimes seeming to come from unexpected directions. Footsteps resonate through the passages. In the silence between sounds, visitors become acutely aware of the absence of the normal ambient noise of the city above. No traffic, no voices from other rooms, no mechanical hums. The silence in the catacombs is profound, broken only by the sounds that visitors themselves make. This silence was intentional in Ricard de Thury's design. He wanted the catacombs to be a place of quiet contemplation, separate from the bustle of daily life. The descent into the catacombs was meant to be a journey away from the concerns of the living world, into a space where visitors could reflect on deeper questions about existence, mortality, and meaning. The route through the public portion of the catacombs is carefully designed to create a narrative experience. It begins with relatively sparse arrangements of bones, allowing visitors to adjust to the environment. Gradually, the arrangements become more elaborate, and the inscriptions more philosophical. The route includes several larger chambers where visitors can pause and take in the full scope of what surrounds them. Near the end of the route, before the ascent back to the surface, there's a final chamber with particularly striking arrangements and a final set of inscriptions, encouraging visitors to carry their reflections back into their daily lives. The Paris Catacombs have inspired numerous artistic and literary works over the past 2 centuries. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have been drawn to the space finding in it, a powerful symbol of mortality memory and the relationship between past and present. The catacombs have appeared in novels, paintings, photographs, and films, each artist interpreting the space through their own vision. But perhaps the most significant artistic achievement is the catacombs themselves, the transformation of millions of anonymous bones into a coherent, meaningful space. The workers and designers who created the catacombs were, in a sense, working with the most challenging medium imaginable human remains. They had to balance respect for the dead with practical necessity, aesthetic vision with ethical constraints. The result is a space that is simultaneously disturbing and beautiful, morbid and profound. The catacombs remind us that death, while universal, need not be meaningless. The careful arrangement of the bones, the thoughtful inscriptions, the deliberate design of the visitor experience. All of these elements work together to create a space where death is acknowledged, respected, and given meaning. The millions of people whose bones rest in the catacombs lived individual lives, had individual stories, individual hopes and fears. Those individual stories are lost to us now, but collectively their remains form a monument to the human experience itself, a reminder that we are all part of a vast continuum of human existence that stretches back through countless generations and will continue long after we ourselves are gone. The official catacombs, with their carefully arranged bones and contemplative inscriptions, represent only a small fraction of the underground world beneath Paris. Beyond the tourist routes, beyond the areas maintained by the city, lies a vast network of tunnels that few people ever see, a hidden realm that has developed its own culture, its own rules, and its own inhabitants. The numbers tell part of the story. The public catacombs occupy approximately 2 kilometers of tunnel, but the total network of old quarry tunnels beneath Paris extends for roughly 300 kilometers. Most of this network has been officially closed since the late 19th century, when authorities became concerned about the structural risks posed by the aging tunnels. Access is prohibited, and the entrances have been sealed with concrete metal gates and walls. Yet despite these barriers, people continue to find their way into this underground labyrinth. These unauthorized explorers call themselves cataphiles lovers of the catacombs. The term emerged in the 1980s, though people had been exploring the forbidden tunnels long before that. The cataphile community is diverse, ranging from teenagers seeking adventure to artists looking for unconventional spaces to middle-aged professionals who find in the tunnels an escape from the pressures of surface life. What unites them is a fascination with this hidden world and a willingness to break the law to experience it. Entering the unauthorized sections of the catacombs requires finding one of the secret entrances. Some cataphiles access the tunnels through the city's sewer system, climbing down through manholes and navigating until they find connections to the old quarries. Others use entrances in the basements of older buildings where original quarry access points were never properly sealed. Still others know of hidden openings in parks or along the banks of the Seine. The locations of these entrances are closely guarded secrets within the cataphile community, shared only with trusted members. Once inside, cataphiles navigate using hand-drawn maps that have been passed down and updated over decades. These maps are far more detailed than any official plans, showing passages, chambers, and features that don't appear in municipal records. The maps use a specialized vocabulary, terms that have evolved within the cataphile community to describe different types of spaces and features. A cathedral is a large chamber with a high ceiling. A beach is an area where sand has accumulated. A fontis is a dangerous collapse zone where the ceiling has given way. The tunnels themselves vary dramatically in character. Some sections are well preserved with smooth limestone walls and stable ceilings. Others are deteriorating with crumbling stone and pools of stagnant water. Some passages are tall enough to walk through comfortably, while others require crawling through tight spaces. The temperature remains constant at about 14 degrees Celsius, but the humidity varies. Some areas are relatively dry, while others drip constantly with water seeping through from above. Navigation in the tunnels is challenging. Without the carefully marked routes of the official catacombs, it's easy to become disoriented. The passages branch and intersect in complex patterns. Many sections look similar, making it difficult to maintain a sense of direction. Cataphiles mark their routes with chalk or spray paint, leaving symbols and messages for others who come after them. But these markings can be confusing. Different groups use different systems, and old markings remain long after the routes they indicated have become impassable. The dangers are real. People have become lost in the tunnels, sometimes for days. In some cases, lost explorers have died from hypothermia, dehydration, or injuries sustained in falls. The tunnels contain numerous hazards, sudden drops, unstable floors, low ceilings that can cause head injuries in the darkness. Flooding is a particular concern. During heavy rains, water can rush through certain passages with little warning. Areas that were dry one day can be waist deep in water the next. Despite these risks, the cataphile community has developed a culture and even a kind of underground society. Regular cataphiles know each other, at least by their underground nicknames. They organize gatherings in the tunnels, parties, concerts, art exhibitions. Some sections of the catacombs have been transformed into semi-permanent installations. Cataphiles have created furnished rooms, complete with chairs, tables, and decorations. They've built bars, stocked with bottles and glasses. They've installed sound systems for music. One of the most famous examples of cataphile creativity came to light in 2004. Police discovered a fully equipped movie theater in a hidden chamber. The space, which cataphiles had named La Mexicaine de Perforation, included a large screen, a professional projection system with film's tiered seating carved into the rock, a bar with a full selection of drinks, and even a restaurant area with tables. The chamber had been wired for electricity, though authorities never determined where the power was coming from. When police returned 3 days later with equipment to dismantle the installation, they found everything had been removed. In its place was a note that read, "Ne cherchez pas," do not search. Not. The incident highlighted both the sophistication of cataphile operations and the difficulty authorities face in controlling the tunnels. The Paris police maintain a special unit officially called the Inspection Générale des Carrières, but nicknamed the Cataflics by cataphiles, dedicated to patrolling the tunnels and preventing unauthorized access. But with 300 kilometers of passages to monitor and limited resources, complete enforcement is impossible. The cataflics focus on the most accessible areas and on responding to reports of activity, but they acknowledge that much of the network remains beyond their effective control. The relationship between cataphiles and authorities is complex. Officially entering the closed sections of the catacombs is illegal, punishable by fines. In practice, enforcement is inconsistent. Some cataphiles have been caught and fined multiple times, but continue their explorations. Others have never encountered police in the tunnels, despite years of regular visits. Some police officers, particularly those who've worked with the cataflics for years, have developed a grudging respect for the more responsible cataphiles, those who don't vandalize, who help rescue lost explorers, and who report structural problems they discover. The cataphile community has its own ethics and informal rules. Experienced cataphiles emphasize the importance of respecting the space. Vandalism is discouraged, while graffiti and art are accepted and even celebrated. Destructive behavior is condemned. Cataphiles are expected to carry out any trash they bring in. They're supposed to help anyone they encounter who's lost or in trouble, regardless of whether they know the person. And they're expected to keep the locations of entrances secret, sharing them only with people they trust, not to abuse the privilege of access. The art created in the tunnels ranges from simple graffiti tags to elaborate murals and installations. Some cataphile artists have spent months or even years on single projects, returning repeatedly to work on detailed paintings or sculptures. The themes often reflect the underground setting: skulls, darkness, labyrinths, and references to death and mortality. But there's also humor, political commentary, and pure aesthetic experimentation. Some of the art is quite accomplished, created by trained artists who use the tunnels as an alternative gallery space. Music is another important part of cataphile culture. The tunnel's acoustics create unique sound properties that musicians find appealing. Small concerts are organized in chambers with particularly good acoustics. The music ranges from classical performances to electronic music to punk rock. These concerts are announced through word of mouth or coded messages on cataphile websites and social media. Attendees might number anywhere from a handful of people to several dozen, depending on the event and the difficulty of reaching the location. The cataphile community also serves a documentary function, though an unofficial one. Cataphiles photograph and map sections of the tunnels that have never been officially surveyed. They document changes over time, new collapses, new graffiti, new installations. Some maintain detailed records of their explorations, creating archives that, while not academically rigorous, contain valuable information about parts of the underground network that authorities know little about. There's also a darker side to the unauthorized tunnels. Not everyone who enters them is a respectful cataphile. Some people use the tunnels for illegal activities, drug use, theft of historical artifacts, or simply destructive vandalism. There have been reports of violent incidents in the tunnels, though these are difficult to verify. The isolation and darkness of the underground spaces can attract people with dangerous intentions, and the absence of any authority presence means that problems can escalate without intervention. The question of what to do about the cataphiles remains unresolved. Some officials argue for stricter enforcement, more patrols, better sealing of entrances, harsher penalties for those caught. Others suggest that the cataphiles serve a useful purpose, acting as informal guardians of the tunnels, reporting structural problems, and even preventing more serious criminal activity through their presence. A few have proposed legalizing access to certain sections, creating designated areas where people could explore safely under some form of supervision. But this idea faces opposition from those who worry about liability and the potential for accidents. For the cataphiles themselves, the appeal of the tunnels goes beyond simple adventure or rebellion. Many speak of the underground world as a place of freedom, where the normal rules and structures of society don't apply. In the tunnels, they say, people are judged not by their appearance, their job, or their social status, but by their knowledge, their skills, and their respect for the space. The darkness equalizes everyone. The challenges of navigation and survival create a sense of community among those who share the experience. The tunnels also offer a connection to Paris's history that's impossible to find on the surface. Walking through passages carved centuries ago, seeing the marks left by quarry workers, encountering bones from medieval cemeteries, all of this creates a tangible link to the past. The cataphiles often speak of feeling like they're walking through history, experiencing the city in a way that no museum or book can provide. As Paris continues to grow and change on the surface, the world beneath remains largely as it has been for centuries. The tunnels don't care about modern development or contemporary politics. They exist outside of time, in a sense, a permanent feature of the city that will outlast any particular era or regime. For the cataphiles who explore them, this permanence is part of the appeal, a reminder that beneath all the changes and chaos of modern life, there are deeper, older realities that endure. From the ancient tunnels beneath Paris, we now travel eastward to China, to a very different kind of underground city, where Derinkuyu was built over centuries, and the Paris Catacombs evolved gradually from old quarries. The underground city beneath Beijing was constructed in a remarkably short period, driven by a very specific fear that gripped the world during the Cold War, the fear of nuclear annihilation. The story begins in the 1960s, when the relationship between the two largest communist powers, China and the Soviet Union, began to deteriorate. For the first decade after the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, China and the Soviet Union had been close allies. The Soviet Union provided technical assistance, military support, and economic aid to the newly established People's Republic of China. But by the late 1950s, ideological differences between the two countries had created tensions that would eventually lead to a complete rupture. The split became public and bitter. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev withdrew technical advisors from China and cut off aid. Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong denounced the Soviet leadership as revisionist and accused them of betraying communist principles. The rhetoric on both sides became increasingly hostile. By the mid-1960s, the two countries were no longer allies, but rivals competing for influence in the communist world and beyond. The situation escalated dramatically in March 1969. Chinese and Soviet forces clashed along their shared border at Zhenbao Island, known as Damansky Island, to the Russians in the Ussuri River. The fighting lasted several days and resulted in casualties on both sides. More clashes followed at other points along the border. For a few tense months, it appeared that the two nuclear-armed communist giants might actually go to war with each other. It was in this context of fear and tension that Mao Zedong issued a directive that would lead to one of the most ambitious construction projects in modern Chinese history. On August 28, 1969, Mao ordered the construction of an extensive network of underground tunnels and shelters beneath Beijing. The project was given the designation Project 131, and its purpose was clear: to provide protection for the population of Beijing in the event of a nuclear attack. The directive called for the construction to follow three principles, which Mao summarized as dig tunnels, deep store grain everywhere, and never seek hegemony. The first two principles were practical: build the deep shelters and ensure food security. The third was ideological, asserting that China's military preparations were defensive rather than aggressive. But the immediate focus was on the tunnels. The scale of what Mao envisioned was staggering. The tunnel system was to extend throughout central Beijing, reaching a depth of 8 to 18 meters below the surface. It was designed to accommodate approximately 40% of Beijing's population, at the time roughly 300,000 people. The system would include not just tunnels for shelter, but complete facilities for sustaining life underground for extended periods. The construction began almost immediately, and it mobilized an enormous workforce. Hundreds of thousands of Beijing residents were called upon to participate. Factory workers, office employees, students, all were expected to contribute labor to the project. The work was organized through work units and neighborhood committees, the basic organizational structures of Chinese urban society at the time. People would finish their regular workday and then report for tunnel construction duty in the evening. The construction methods were remarkably low-tech given the scale of the project. Workers used hand tools, picks, shovels, and hammers. They worked by the light of oil lamps and later electric bulbs. The soil and rock removed from the tunnels had to be carried out in baskets and wheelbarrows. There was no sophisticated machinery, no modern excavation equipment. This was manual labor on a massive scale, sustained by political mobilization and the genuine fear that nuclear war might be imminent. The geology beneath Beijing made the work somewhat easier than it might have been elsewhere. Much of the area sits on relatively soft sedimentary soil that could be dug without blasting. But this same soft soil also required extensive reinforcement to prevent collapses. Workers lined the tunnels with brick and concrete, creating arched ceilings that would distribute weight and provide structural stability. The construction techniques drew on traditional Chinese building methods adapted for underground use. The tunnel system was designed with multiple functions in mind. The primary purpose was shelter during an attack, but the planners also envisioned the tunnels serving as a means of moving troops and supplies if Beijing came under assault. The system included numerous entrances scattered throughout the city, often hidden in ordinary buildings, shops, schools, government offices, even public toilets. These entrances were designed to be inconspicuous from the outside, but could accommodate large numbers of people moving quickly underground in an emergency. Inside the tunnel system, the planners created what amounted to an underground city. There were designated sleeping areas with spaces for families to shelter together. There were communal kitchens equipped with stoves and storage for food and water. Medical facilities were established, including operating rooms for emergency surgery. The system included its own water supply, with wells drilled to access underground aquifers. Ventilation shafts provided air circulation, and the system was designed with multiple air filtration points to protect against radioactive fallout. The tunnels also contained facilities that spoke to the expectation of extended occupation. There were schools where children could continue their education underground. There were meeting halls for political gatherings and community activities. There was even a movie theater, recognizing that people would need entertainment and distraction during what might be months of underground existence. Some sections included small factories where essential goods could be produced. The defensive features of the system were sophisticated. The tunnels were divided into sections that could be sealed off independently. Blast doors at key points could protect deeper sections even if outer areas were breached. The depth of the tunnels, up to 18 meters in some places, provided protection against all but direct nuclear strikes. The multiple entrances meant that even if some were destroyed or blocked, others would remain accessible. The construction continued for approximately 10 years, finally concluding in the late 1970s. By the time it was finished, the system extended for roughly 30 kilometers of tunnels beneath central Beijing. It contained more than 90 entrances and could accommodate hundreds of thousands of people. The project had consumed enormous resources and countless hours of labor. Estimates suggest that the total volume of earth and rock removed during construction exceeded that of the Ming tombs, one of China's most famous historical sites. But even as the construction was being completed, the circumstances that had motivated it were changing. Relations between China and the Soviet Union, while still tense, had stepped back from the brink of war. More significantly, China's relationship with the United States was transforming. In 1972, President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China, beginning a process of normalization that would fundamentally alter the global strategic situation. The threat of nuclear attack on Beijing, while never entirely eliminated, had diminished considerably. The underground city, built at such enormous cost and effort, found itself without a clear purpose. It was maintained for some years as a civil defense facility, with periodic drills and inspections. But as the Cold War tensions eased and China began its period of economic reform in the 1980s, the tunnel system gradually fell into disuse. Maintenance became sporadic. Sections began to deteriorate. The entrances were sealed or simply forgotten as the buildings above them were renovated or demolished. In the early 2000s, Chinese authorities made a decision to open portions of the underground city to tourists. A section in the Tianmen area of central Beijing was cleaned up, fitted with lighting, and open for public tours. Visitors could descend into the tunnels and see the sleeping quarters, the kitchens, the medical facilities, all preserved much as they had been when the system was operational. Signs explained the history of the construction and the Cold War context that had motivated it. The tours proved popular, attracting both Chinese visitors curious about this hidden aspect of their city's history and foreign tourists interested in Cold War relics. Walking through the tunnels provided a tangible connection to a period when the threat of nuclear war seemed very real. The facilities, though dated, demonstrated the seriousness with which that threat had been taken and the scale of China's response. However, the tourist access was relatively short-lived. In 2008, as Beijing prepared to host the Olympic Games, authorities closed most of the accessible sections of the underground city. The official explanation cited safety concerns. The tunnels were aging, and there were worries about structural stability. But there were also likely security considerations. The tunnel system connected to sensitive government buildings and military facilities, and authorities may have been uncomfortable with the level of public access and the attention the tunnels were receiving. Since the closure, the fate of the underground city has been unclear. Some sections have reportedly been converted to other uses, storage facilities, parking garages, or commercial spaces. Other sections remain sealed and abandoned. There have been reports of homeless people and migrant workers living in some of the tunnels, creating an underground community of a very different sort than what the planners had envisioned. But verifying these reports is difficult, as access to most of the system is now restricted. The Beijing underground city represents a fascinating case study in how fear can drive massive collective action. In the space of a decade, a city mobilized its entire population to construct an elaborate shelter system against a threat that, while real, never materialized in the way that was feared. The project demonstrated both the organizational capacity of the Chinese state and the genuine anxiety that the Cold War nuclear standoff created even in countries that were not the primary antagonists. It also raises questions about the legacy of such projects. The tunnels beneath Beijing still exist, a vast network of spaces that cost enormous resources to create, but now serve no clear purpose. They're too extensive to simply abandon, but their original function is obsolete. They represent a moment in history, a particular configuration of fears and responses that has passed. Yet they remain a hidden layer beneath the modern city, a reminder of a time when the world seemed on the edge of nuclear catastrophe, and survival meant going underground. We've seen how the Beijing underground city was constructed in response to Cold War fears. Now let's examine what happened to this vast shelter system after the threat it was built to counter had faded, a transformation that reveals much about how societies deal with the relics of their anxious past. By the mid-1980s, the underground city beneath Beijing had entered a period of neglect. The Chinese government now focused on economic reform and opening to the world under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, had little interest in maintaining an expensive civil defense system, built for a war that seemed increasingly unlikely. The regular inspections and maintenance that had characterized the first years after construction became less frequent. Equipment was not replaced when it broke down. The ventilation systems, so carefully designed to filter contaminated air, sat idle and began to deteriorate. Yet the tunnels themselves remained structurally sound. The brick and concrete construction had been done well, and the relatively stable underground environment meant that deterioration was slow. The spaces simply sat empty, dark, and largely forgotten by the city above. Only a few government departments maintained records of the system's extent and locations. For most Beijing residents, the underground city became a vague memory, something their parents or grandparents had helped build, but which no longer seemed relevant to contemporary life. During this period of official neglect, the tunnels began to find unofficial uses. In a city where space was at a premium and housing remained scarce, the underground rooms offered shelter to those who had few other options. Migrant workers coming to Beijing from rural areas, unable to afford regular housing, discovered entrances to the tunnels and began living in them. These underground residents, sometimes called rat tribe or rat people in Chinese media, created makeshift homes in the former shelter spaces. The living conditions in these underground dwellings were harsh. The rooms were damp and poorly ventilated. Natural light was non-existent. The temperature remained cool year-round, which was tolerable in summer, but uncomfortable in winter. Yet for people with limited means, the tunnels offered certain advantages. The rent was minimal or non-existent. The spaces provided shelter from the elements. And despite the conditions, there was a sense of community among the underground residents who shared the challenges of this unusual living situation. By the late 1990s, estimates suggested that thousands of people might be living in various sections of the underground city. Some areas had developed into small underground neighborhoods, with residents establishing informal rules and social structures. Small businesses emerged, shops selling basic necessities, food vendors, even small restaurants operating in the tunnel spaces. This underground economy existed largely outside official oversight, a hidden layer of urban life that authorities acknowledged but did little to address. The situation began to change in the early 2000s as Beijing prepared to present itself to the world as a modern, sophisticated capital. City officials became more aware of the underground communities and more concerned about the image they presented. There were also genuine safety concerns. The tunnels had not been designed as permanent residences, and the living conditions posed health risks. Fire safety was a particular worry. The tunnels had limited exits, and a fire could trap residents with no means of escape. At the same time, there was growing interest in the historical significance of the underground city. Chinese historians and journalists began writing about the tunnels, documenting their construction and the Cold War context that had motivated it. For younger generations who had no memory of the tensions with the Soviet Union, the underground city was a revelation, a tangible reminder of a period in Chinese history that was fading from living memory. This historical interest led to the decision to open a portion of the underground city to tourists. In 2000, a section in the Tiananmen area near Tiananmen Square was cleaned, renovated, and prepared for public access. The renovation preserved the original features while adding modern lighting and safety equipment. Signs were installed explaining the history and function of different spaces. Guides were trained to lead tours and answer questions. The tours began modestly, but quickly gained popularity. The entrance was through a small shop on the surface. Visitors would pay a small fee, then descend a staircase into the tunnels below. The tour route covered about a kilometer of tunnels, showcasing the various facilities that had been built into the system. Visitors could see the sleeping quarters with their rows of simple bunks. They could walk through the communal kitchens, still equipped with large stoves and storage areas. The medical facilities with their examination rooms and operating tables provided a sobering reminder of the casualties that had been anticipated. One of the most popular stops on the tour was the movie theater. The space still contained rows of seats facing a blank wall where films would have been projected. The theater represented something poignant, the recognition that even in the midst of nuclear war, people would need entertainment and distraction. It spoke to a kind of optimism, or perhaps denial, about what life underground might be like. The tours attracted a diverse audience. Older Chinese visitors came to see a piece of their own history, a project many of them had contributed labor to in their youth. They would point out features to their children, and grandchildren explaining what it had been like to work on the construction. Foreign tourists were fascinated by this Cold War relic, particularly those from countries that had built their own civil defense systems. The underground city offered a glimpse into how different societies had responded to similar fears. The guides on these tours had to navigate sensitive political territory. The official narrative emphasized the defensive nature of the project. China had been threatened and had taken reasonable precautions to protect its people. The tours avoided dwelling on the ideological conflicts that had motivated the construction or the enormous cost in labor and resources. Instead, they focused on the engineering achievements and the dedication of the workers who had built the system. For several years, the tours operated successfully. The underground city became a minor but notable tourist attraction in Beijing, mentioned in guidebooks and recommended by travelers who had visited. The revenue generated helped offset the costs of maintaining the accessible section. There was even discussion of opening additional sections to accommodate more visitors. But in 2008, as Beijing prepared to host the Olympic Games, the situation changed abruptly. The city government announced that the underground city tours would be suspended. The official explanation cited safety concerns. Inspections had revealed structural issues that needed to be addressed before public access could continue. The entrances were sealed, and the tours stopped. The timing suggested that other factors were at play beyond simple safety concerns. The Olympics would bring unprecedented international attention to Beijing, and authorities were sensitive about the city's image. The underground city, with its associations with Cold War paranoia and its current use by poor residents, may have seemed like an embarrassment. There were also security considerations. The tunnel system connected to government buildings and military facilities, and the increased scrutiny that came with the Olympics may have made authorities uncomfortable with public access. At the same time, the government began a more systematic effort to clear the underground residents from the tunnels. Citing safety and health concerns, authorities closed many of the entrances that had been used by the underground communities. Residents were given notice to leave, and in some cases, assistance was provided to help them find alternative housing. The evictions were not always smooth. Some residents resisted, arguing that they had nowhere else to go. But over the course of several years, most of the underground communities were dispersed. Since 2008, access to the underground city has been severely restricted. A few sections reportedly remain open for limited tours, but these are not widely advertised and require special permission. Most of the system is now sealed with entrances blocked and guarded. The tunnels themselves remain, but they've returned to a state of dormancy, neither actively used nor completely abandoned. The question of what to do with the underground city remains unresolved. Some have proposed converting sections into museums or cultural spaces, preserving them as historical monuments to the Cold War era. Others suggest practical uses, storage facilities, parking garages, or infrastructure corridors for utilities. There have even been proposals to develop parts of the system as commercial space, creating underground shopping areas or entertainment venues. But any significant redevelopment faces substantial challenges. The tunnels are aging, and bringing them up to modern safety standards would be expensive. The system is so extensive that comprehensive renovation would require enormous resources. And there are political sensitivities. The underground city represents a period of Chinese history that the current government has mixed feelings about acknowledging. So the tunnels wait a vast network of spaces beneath one of the world's largest cities, built for a purpose that never came to pass. Briefly opened to the public, then sealed again. They represent a peculiar kind of monument, not to victory or achievement, but to fear and preparation, to the enormous effort societies will undertake when they believe their survival is at stake. The underground city is a reminder that the Cold War, while it never became hot in the way that was feared, still shaped the world in profound ways, leaving behind not just political legacies but physical ones, vast structures built to protect against catastrophes that thankfully never occurred. For the people of Beijing, the underground city has become something of an urban legend, a hidden world that most know exists, but few have seen. Occasionally, construction projects will break through into old tunnel sections, reminding the city that beneath its modern surface lies this other layer, this shadow city built in darker times. And perhaps that's the most appropriate fate for such a place, neither completely forgotten nor fully embraced, but existing in a kind of liminal state, a physical reminder of fears that have faded but never entirely disappeared. From the documented reality of Beijing's underground city, we now turn to something more elusive, a network of tunnels beneath Moscow, whose very existence remains officially unconfirmed. This is Metro 2, sometimes called D6, a secret subway system that allegedly runs parallel to Moscow's famous public metro, but serves very different purposes. The Moscow Metro opened in 1935 as one of the most beautiful subway systems in the world. Its stations are decorated with chandeliers, mosaics, and marble built as palaces for the people under Stalin's direction. The system is also remarkably deep. Many stations lie 50 meters or more below the surface, originally designed to serve as bomb shelters in case of war. This dual purpose was no secret. During World War II, Muscovites sheltered in metro stations during German air raids, and the system proved its value as a civil defense facility. But according to numerous reports that have circulated since the Soviet era, the public metro is only part of Moscow's underground transportation network. Metro 2, if it exists, is said to be a separate system built even deeper than the public metro, connecting key government and military facilities throughout Moscow and extending to locations outside the city. Unlike the ornate public stations, Metro 2 would be purely functional, a secure transportation system for government and military use designed to remain operational even during nuclear war. The first substantial reports of Metro 2 emerged during the Cold War, primarily from Western intelligence agencies. American and British intelligence analysts studying Soviet civil defense preparations concluded that Moscow must have some kind of secret transportation system for evacuating leadership in an emergency. The logic was compelling. The Soviet government had invested heavily in hardened command bunkers and continuity of government facilities, and these would need to be connected in a way that couldn't be disrupted by surface attacks. Soviet defectors occasionally mentioned the secret metro in their debriefings, though usually with limited details. They spoke of restricted metro lines of stations that didn't appear on public maps, of tunnels that branched off from the regular system into areas where ordinary workers were not permitted. But concrete evidence remained scarce. The Soviet government predictably never acknowledged the existence of any such system. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, information began to emerge more freely. In 1992, a Russian historian and former government official named Mikhail Poltoranin publicly stated that Metro 2 existed and was even longer than the public metro system. He claimed it had been built in stages beginning under Stalin and continuing through the Cold War. According to Poltoranin, the system had 4 main lines connecting the Kremlin to various strategic locations. Poltoranin's account described one line running from the Kremlin to Vnukovo Airport, providing an evacuation route for government leaders. Another supposedly connected the Kremlin to the headquarters of the FSB, the successor to the KGB in Lubyanka. A third line was said to run to a massive underground command bunker in Ramenki, a district in southwestern Moscow. The fourth allegedly connected to an underground city at Sharapovo, about 60 kilometers outside Moscow, where the government could relocate in case of nuclear war. Other sources have provided additional details over the years. Some reports describe Metro 2 as running much deeper than the public metro, as deep as 200 meters in some sections. The stations would be Spartan compared to the ornate public ones, but equipped with all necessary facilities for long-term occupation. The trains would be similar to those on the public metro, but modified for the specific requirements of government and military transport. Workers who claim to have been involved in construction or maintenance of Metro 2 have occasionally come forward, though always anonymously or after leaving Russia. They describe tunnels with restricted access, special security clearances required even to enter certain areas, and strict compartmentalization of information. Workers on one section would know nothing about other sections. The construction was allegedly carried out by special military engineering units, not the regular workers who built the public metro. Urban explorers in Moscow have reported finding evidence that supports the existence of Metro 2. Some have discovered sealed passages branching off from public metro tunnels, blocked by heavy doors or concrete walls. Others have found ventilation shafts in unexpected locations, far from any public metro line. In some cases, explorers have heard sounds, trains, or machinery coming from areas where no public metro lines run. But accessing these restricted areas is extremely difficult and illegal, and those who try risk serious legal consequences. The Russian government's response to questions about Metro 2 has been consistent ambiguity. Officials neither confirm nor deny its existence. When asked directly, they typically deflect or refuse to comment, citing national security. This non-denial denial has only fueled speculation. If Metro 2 didn't exist, critics argue why not simply say so. The continued secrecy suggests there is something to hide. From an engineering perspective, the construction of Metro 2 would have been entirely feasible. The Soviet Union had extensive experience with underground construction, both for the public metro and for military facilities. The country had built numerous underground command bunkers, missile silos, and other hardened facilities. Building a secret metro system would have been well within Soviet capabilities, particularly given the resources and labor available to the government. The strategic logic for such a system is also sound. During the Cold War, the Soviet leadership was acutely aware that Moscow would be a primary target in any nuclear exchange. Ensuring continuity of government required not just hardened bunkers, but also secure transportation between them. Surface roads could be destroyed or blocked. The public metro, while deep, was still public. It couldn't be secured for exclusive government use in an emergency. A separate secret system would solve these problems. Some researchers have attempted to map the alleged Metro 2 system based on various reports and clues. These maps show lines radiating from the Kremlin to key locations around Moscow and beyond. The maps are speculative, based on fragmentary information, but they present a plausible picture of what such a system might look like. The main lines would connect major government and military facilities with branch lines extending to other important locations. One particularly intriguing aspect of the Metro 2 reports concerns underground cities connected to the system. Several locations around Moscow are rumored to contain vast underground complexes, essentially self-contained cities capable of housing thousands of people for extended periods. The complex at Ramenki, often called Bunker 42, or the facility, is said to be one of the largest with multiple levels, extending deep underground, complete with living quarters, command centers, and all necessary support facilities. Some of these facilities have been partially confirmed. In recent years, the Russian government has acknowledged the existence of certain Cold War-era bunkers, and even opened a few as museums. One such facility, officially called Bunker 42 and located near the Taganskaya metro station, is now a museum where visitors can tour a former command bunker. But authorities maintain that this facility was never connected to any secret metro system. It was simply a standalone bunker. The question of whether Metro 2 is still operational, if it exists, remains open. Some analysts believe that even if the system was built during the Cold War, it may have been abandoned or fallen into disrepair after the Soviet collapse. The economic chaos of the 1990s meant that many military and government facilities lost funding and were neglected. However, others point out that Russia under Vladimir Putin has invested heavily in restoring and modernizing military infrastructure. If Metro 2 existed, it would likely be considered strategically important enough to maintain. There have been occasional incidents that seem to support the existence of Metro 2. In 2010, a mysterious fire broke out in a tunnel near the Sportivnaya metro station. Official reports said it was in a cable tunnel, but some observers noted that the location and nature of the fire were consistent with it having occurred in a deeper tunnel system. In 2017, construction workers in central Moscow reportedly broke through into an unknown tunnel, but the incident was quickly hushed up and details remained scarce. The Metro 2 story also intersects with broader narratives about Russian government secrecy and the persistence of Soviet-era security culture. Even decades after the Cold War ended, the Russian government maintains strict control over information about military and security matters. The refusal to definitively address the Metro 2 question fits this pattern, neither confirming nor denying, keeping potential adversaries uncertain about capabilities and infrastructure. For Muscovites, Metro 2 has become part of urban folklore. It's discussed in the same breath as other conspiracy theories and urban legends, but with the crucial difference that this legend may actually be true. The idea that there's a hidden world beneath the city, a shadow metro system that ordinary citizens will never see, has a certain appeal. It reinforces the sense that there are layers to reality, that the world visible on the surface is not the complete picture. Whether Metro 2 exists in the form described in various reports, or whether it's a more limited system that has been exaggerated through rumor and speculation, remains unknown to anyone outside the highest levels of Russian government and military. What seems clear is that Moscow, like many major cities, has underground infrastructure beyond what the public sees. The extent and nature of that infrastructure is the question. The Metro 2 story reminds us that even in an age of satellites and surveillance technology, it's still possible to keep secrets, particularly when those secrets are buried deep underground. The earth itself becomes a shield against observation, and what lies beneath the surface remains hidden unless someone with knowledge chooses to reveal it. For now, Metro 2 remains in that shadowy realm between confirmed fact and persistent rumor, a mystery beneath Moscow that may never be fully solved. While Moscow's Metro 2 remains shrouded in secrecy and official ambiguity, Britain took a different approach to its Cold War underground preparations. The facility known as Burlington was very real, very extensive, and after decades of secrecy, its existence has been officially acknowledged. This underground city, hidden beneath the English countryside, was designed to become the functioning heart of British government in the aftermath of nuclear war. The story of Burlington begins in the early 1950s as the Cold War was intensifying and the reality of nuclear weapons was becoming clear. Britain had been devastated by German bombing during World War II, and military planners understood that future wars would be even more destructive. The development of hydrogen bombs made it clear that a nuclear attack on Britain could destroy London and other major cities in minutes. The government needed a plan for continuity, a way to ensure that some form of governance could continue, even if the capital was destroyed. The location chosen for this emergency government headquarters was Corsham, a small town in Wiltshire, about 100 miles west of London. The area had been used for military purposes during World War II, and it had a crucial advantage. Beneath the town lay an extensive network of old stone quarries. These quarries, carved out over centuries to extract Bath stone for construction, provided ready-made underground spaces that could be converted into a secure facility. The project that would become Burlington began in 1955, though it wouldn't receive that code name until later. Initially, it was simply referred to as a government facility or emergency headquarters. The work was carried out in strict secrecy. The quarries were already owned by the government, and the remote location made it easier to control access and maintain security. Workers were brought in under various cover stories, and the true purpose of the construction was known only to those with the highest security clearances. The scale of Burlington was extraordinary. The facility extended over approximately 35 acres, carved into the limestone bedrock about 30 meters below the surface. This wasn't a simple bunker. It was designed as a complete underground city, capable of housing and sustaining 4,000 people for up to 3 months. The planners envisioned that in the event of nuclear war, the entire functioning apparatus of British government would relocate to Burlington and continue operations from there. The facility was organized into multiple sections, each serving specific functions. There were office spaces where government ministers and senior civil servants could work. These offices were equipped with desks, filing systems, and all the necessary equipment for conducting government business. There were communication centers with telephone exchanges, radio equipment, and later computer systems. These would allow the underground government to maintain contact with military forces, surviving local authorities, and potentially with other governments. Living quarters were provided for the 4,000 anticipated residents. These weren't comfortable accommodations. Space was at a premium, and the priority was functionality rather than comfort. Dormitories contained rows of bunk beds. There were communal dining halls, kitchens capable of preparing meals for thousands, and storage areas for food supplies. The facility maintained stockpiles of tinned and dried foods that would last for the anticipated 3-month occupation period. Medical facilities were extensive, recognizing that in the aftermath of nuclear war, medical care would be critical and surface hospitals would likely be destroyed or overwhelmed. Burlington included a fully equipped hospital with operating theaters, recovery wards, and supplies of medicines and equipment. Medical staff would be among those relocated to the facility in an emergency. The facility even included a BBC studio. The planners recognized that communication with any surviving population would be essential, both for maintaining order and for providing instructions on survival and recovery. The underground studio would allow the government to broadcast to whatever radio receivers remained operational in the devastated country above. One of the more unusual features was a pub. The planners understood that people confined underground for months would need some form of recreation and social space. The pub, called the Rose and Crown by Cappadocia, was a fully functional bar where residents could gather during off-duty hours. It represented a very British approach to crisis planning. Even in the aftermath of nuclear war, there should be a place for a pint. The ventilation and life support systems were sophisticated. Multiple air intake and exhaust shafts connected the facility to the surface, positioned at various locations to ensure that if some were blocked or contaminated, others would remain functional. The air filtration system was designed to remove radioactive particles, chemical agents, and biological contaminants. The facility had its own power generation, with diesel generators providing electricity independent of the national grid, which would certainly be destroyed in a nuclear attack. Water was supplied from underground sources, with wells drilled to access aquifers deep below the facility. The water system included storage tanks and treatment facilities to ensure a safe supply throughout the anticipated occupation period. Sewage and waste management systems were designed to operate independently, with treatment facilities contained within the complex. Burlington was connected to the outside world through several means. Secure telephone lines buried deep underground and hardened against electromagnetic pulse effects linked the facility to military bases and the other government installations. Radio antennas designed to survive the initial attack would allow communication with military forces and potentially with allied governments. The facility also had direct connections to Britain's early warning systems, which would provide notice of incoming missiles and allow the government to evacuate to Burlington before the attack. The facility was maintained in a state of constant readiness throughout the Cold War. Staff rotated through on regular schedules, conducting maintenance, updating equipment, and ensuring everything remained operational. Supplies were regularly checked and rotated. The government conducted periodic exercises with officials practicing the evacuation to Burlington and the procedures for operating the underground government. These exercises revealed both the strengths and limitations of the plan. The facility could indeed house and sustain 4,000 people, and the systems generally worked as designed. But the exercises also highlighted uncomfortable questions. Who exactly would be evacuated to Burlington's senior government? Officials and military commanders, certainly. Essential technical staff and support personnel. But what about members of Parliament? What about the royal family? The selection criteria were never fully resolved, and the question of who would be saved while millions died above ground was deeply troubling to many involved in the planning. There was also the question of what would happen after the 3 months of supplies ran out. The planners assumed that by then, radiation levels would have decreased enough that people could emerge and begin the work of rebuilding. But this assumption was optimistic. A full-scale nuclear exchange would likely create conditions that would make the surface uninhabitable for far longer than 3 months. The facility had no plan for long-term sustainability beyond that initial period. As the Cold War progressed, Burlington was continuously updated. New communications equipment was installed as technology advanced. The facility was expanded in some areas and reconfigured in others to accommodate changing requirements. By the 1980s, Burlington represented decades of investment and planning a massive underground installation that the government hoped would never need to be used. The end of the Cold War, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, brought the question of Burlington's future into focus. The facility was no longer needed for its original purpose, but it represented a significant investment and couldn't simply be abandoned. For several years, it continued to be maintained, though at reduced levels. Various alternative uses were considered: data storage, secure archives, emergency operations center for non-nuclear crises. The existence of Burlington remained officially secret until 2004, nearly 15 years after the Cold War ended. The revelation came not through an official announcement, but through investigative journalism. A BBC documentary exposed the facility's existence and purpose, drawing on interviews with former workers and officials. The government, faced with a disclosure, acknowledged Burlington's existence and provided some details about its history and function. Since then, Burlington has been maintained, but not as an active facility. It's not open to the public. The government continues to restrict access, citing both security concerns and the practical difficulties of safely managing tours in such a large, underground complex. Occasionally, former workers or officials give interviews describing their experiences with the facility, adding to the public understanding of what Burlington was and how it functioned. Burlington stands as a monument to Cold War planning and to the extremes that governments were willing to go to ensure their own survival. It also raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of such preparations. The facility could save 4,000 people, a tiny fraction of Britain's population. The rest would be left to face nuclear war without protection. This inequality was inherent in the concept of continuity of government planning, but it troubled many who were involved in or aware of the Burlington project. Today, Burlington remains beneath the Wiltshire countryside, a vast underground city that was built for a catastrophe that never came. It's a physical reminder of how close the world came to nuclear war during the Cold War, and of the elaborate preparations that governments made for that possibility. The facility exists in a kind of limbo, no longer needed for its original purpose, but too significant to simply abandon or destroy. It waits a hidden monument to fears that have faded but never entirely disappeared. From Britain's Burlington, we cross the Atlantic to examine the United States' approach to underground survival during the Cold War. America, as the other nuclear superpower, invested heavily in underground facilities. But unlike Britain's centralized Burlington, the American system consisted of multiple installations scattered across the country, a network of bunkers, command centers, and shelters that some believe may be connected by tunnels extending for hundreds or even thousands of miles. The confirmed facilities are impressive enough on their own. The most famous is perhaps the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, built into the granite heart of Cheyenne Mountain near Colorado Springs. Construction began in 1961 at the height of Cold War tensions and took 5 years to complete. The facility was designed to house the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, responsible for detecting and responding to aerospace threats, including incoming ballistic missiles. The engineering required to build Cheyenne Mountain was extraordinary. Workers excavated deep into solid granite, removing millions of tons of rock to create a series of chambers. The facility extends about a third of a mile into the mountain, protected by 2,000 feet of granite overhead. This massive rock shield would protect the facility from all but a direct hit by the most powerful nuclear weapons. The entrance is through blast doors, weighing 25 tons each, designed to seal the facility against nuclear blast effects and radiation. Inside the facility contains 15 buildings, all freestanding within the excavated chambers. These buildings are mounted on massive springs, more than 1,000 steel springs, each weighing 1,000 pounds. This spring system would absorb the shock waves from a nearby nuclear explosion, protecting the equipment and personnel inside, even if the mountain itself shook from the blast. The facility has its own power generation, water supply, and air filtration systems designed to sustain operations for extended periods without any connection to the outside world. Cheyenne Mountain became operational in 1966 and served as NORAD's primary command center throughout the Cold War. The facility was staffed around the clock with personnel monitoring for any signs of attack. The famous scene from the movie War Games, showing a massive screen displaying potential missile launches, was inspired by the actual operations center at Cheyenne Mountain, though the real facility was less dramatic and more focused on data analysis than the Hollywood version suggested. Another major underground facility is the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, often called the Underground Pentagon, located about 6 miles from Camp David and 60 miles from Washington, D.C. Raven Rock was built in the early 1950s as an alternate command center for the Pentagon. Like Cheyenne Mountain, it's carved into solid rock, in this case greenstone, and designed to survive nuclear attack. The facility is large enough to house several thousand personnel and contains all the equipment necessary for commanding U.S. military forces. Raven Rock's existence has been publicly acknowledged, though details about its current operations remain classified. During the Cold War, it was maintained in constant readiness, with a skeleton staff present at all times and procedures in place for rapidly evacuating Pentagon leadership to the facility in case of emergency. On September 11, 2001, when the Pentagon was attacked, key personnel were indeed evacuated to Raven Rock, demonstrating that the facility remains operational and relevant even in the post-Cold War era. Mount Weather, located in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains, about 50 miles from Washington, D.C., serves a different purpose. This facility is the primary relocation site for civilian government leadership in an emergency. Officially called the High Point Special Facility, Mount Weather is managed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and is designed to house the President's key cabinet members and essential staff needed to maintain continuity of government. Mount Weather's existence was secret until 1974, when a plane crashed near the facility, drawing public attention to the site. Since then, the government has acknowledged the facility's existence, but provides few details about its capabilities or operations. What is known suggests it's a substantial installation, with office space, living quarters, and all necessary support facilities for housing and sustaining government operations for extended periods. These three facilities, Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, and Mount Weather, are the most well-known of America's underground installations, but they're far from the only ones. Across the country, dozens of other underground facilities were built during the Cold War for various purposes. Some housed command centers for specific military branches or functions. Others served as communications hubs, relay stations, or data centers. Many were built to house nuclear weapons or to serve as launch control centers for intercontinental ballistic missiles. The question that has intrigued researchers and conspiracy theorists for decades is whether these facilities are connected by tunnels. The idea of a vast underground transportation network linking America's key installations has been a persistent rumor since the Cold War. Proponents of this theory point to several factors that make such a network plausible. First, there's the strategic logic. If underground facilities are meant to ensure continuity of government and military command during a nuclear war, they need to be able to communicate and coordinate. While radio and satellite communications would be the primary means, these could be disrupted by electromagnetic pulse effects or physical destruction of antennas and relay stations. Underground tunnels would provide a communication and transportation link that couldn't be disrupted by surface attacks. Second, there's the technology. The United States developed sophisticated tunnel boring machines during the Cold War capable of creating large tunnels through various types of rock. Some of these machines, developed by organizations like the Los Alamos National Laboratory, could reportedly bore tunnels at remarkable speeds. If the government wanted to create an underground transportation network, the technology to do so existed. Third, there are the witness accounts. Over the years, various individuals, former military personnel, construction workers, government contractors have claimed knowledge of underground tunnel systems. Some describe seeing or working on tunnels that extended for miles, connecting military bases or government facilities. Others report encountering underground transportation systems trains or vehicles operating in tunnels far below the surface. One frequently cited account comes from Phil Schneider, a geologist and engineer who claimed to have worked on underground base construction projects in the 1970s and 1980s. Schneider described a network of deep, underground military bases connected by high-speed trains traveling through tunnels. He claimed these tunnels were bored by advanced machines and extended across the country. Schneider's accounts were detailed and specific, though they also included elements that many found incredible. He died under mysterious circumstances in 1996, which some interpret as evidence he was revealing genuine secrets, while others see it as tragic but unrelated to his claims. The problem with evaluating these claims is the lack of verifiable evidence. The facilities themselves, Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, Mount Weather, are documented and acknowledged. But tunnels connecting them, no official acknowledgement exists. No construction records are publicly available. No former workers have provided documentation or photographs. The claims rest on testimony alone, and testimony without corroboration is difficult to assess. Some researchers have attempted to find indirect evidence of tunnel networks. They've studied government budgets looking for unexplained expenditures that might have funded tunnel construction. They've analyzed seismic data, searching for patterns that might indicate underground excavation. They've mapped the locations of known facilities, looking for logical routes that tunnels might follow. But none of these approaches has produced definitive evidence. The government's response to questions about underground tunnel networks has been consistent non-response. Officials neither confirm nor deny the existence of such tunnels. When asked directly, they typically cite national security and decline to comment. This silence is interpreted differently by different people. Skeptics argue that if the tunnels didn't exist, the government would simply say so. Believers counter that the government routinely denies the existence of classified programs, even when those programs are real. What we can say with certainty is that the United States built numerous underground facilities during the Cold War. These facilities were designed to ensure continuity of government and military command during nuclear war, and that connecting them would have made strategic sense. Whether such connections actually exist remains an open question. There's also the question of what might have been built more recently. The facilities we know about, Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, Mount Weather, date from the 1950s and 1960s. But underground construction didn't stop with the end of the Cold War. The U.S. military continues to build underground facilities for various purposes. Modern tunnel boring technology is far more advanced than what was available in the 1960s. If there was a desire to create an underground transportation network, it would be more feasible now than it was during the Cold War. The persistence of theories about underground tunnel networks reflects both genuine uncertainty about classified government programs and a broader cultural fascination with hidden infrastructure. The idea that there's a secret world beneath our feet, a network of tunnels and facilities that the public never sees, has obvious appeal. It suggests that the reality we perceive is incomplete, that there are layers of truth hidden from ordinary view. Whether or not a comprehensive tunnel network exists, the confirmed underground facilities themselves represent a significant aspect of Cold War history and ongoing national security infrastructure. They demonstrate the lengths to which the United States was willing to go to ensure survival and continuity in the face of nuclear threat. They represent billions of dollars of investment, decades of planning and construction, and the work of thousands of people who built and maintained these installations. These facilities continue to serve important functions today, even though the Cold War threat they were built to counter has evolved. Cheyenne Mountain still monitors aerospace threats, though NORAD's day-to-day operations have moved to a nearby surface facility. Raven Rock and Mount Weather remain ready to house government and military leadership in emergencies. The underground infrastructure built during the Cold War has proven durable and adaptable, serving new purposes as threats have changed. The story of America's underground facilities is ultimately a story about how nations prepare for their worst fears. The facilities exist because at one point in history, nuclear war seemed not just possible but likely, and the government felt obligated to take extraordinary measures to ensure that some form of organized society could survive and rebuild. Whether those facilities are connected by tunnels or stand alone, they represent a remarkable achievement of engineering and a sobering reminder of the nuclear age we still live in. We've journeyed through underground cities across continents and centuries, from ancient Derinkuyu to Cold War bunkers, from Paris's realm of the dead to Beijing's vast shelter network. Now, as we near the end of our exploration, let's step back and consider the fundamental question that connects all these disparate places. Why do humans build underground? The most obvious answer is protection. Throughout history, going underground has offered shelter from threats that couldn't be escaped on the surface. In Cappadocia, the underground cities provided refuge from invading armies. The massive stone doors, the multiple levels of defense, the capacity to shelter entire communities for months. All of these features make sense only in the context of repeated military threats. The people who carved Derinkuyu into the rock were responding to a very real danger: armies that would sweep through the region, destroying surface settlements and killing or enslaving the inhabitants. The Cold War bunkers served a similar protective function, though against a very different threat. Burlington, Cheyenne, Mountain, the Beijing underground city all were built to protect against nuclear weapons. The nature of this threat shaped the design of these facilities in specific ways. They had to be deep enough to survive blast effects and radiation. They needed air filtration systems to remove radioactive particles. They required self-contained life support systems because the surface world might be uninhabitable for extended periods. The engineering solutions were sophisticated, but the underlying motivation was the same as it had been for the builders of Derinkuyu. Thousands of years earlier, create a space where life can continue when the surface becomes too dangerous. But protection alone doesn't fully explain the scale and sophistication of many underground cities. Consider the Paris Catacombs. These weren't built for protection. They were built to solve a space problem. Paris had run out of room to bury its dead. The cemeteries were overflowing, creating public health hazards. The solution was to move the bones underground into the old quarry tunnels that happened to exist beneath the city. This represents a different motivation for underground construction: efficient use of space. Cities are constrained by their surface area. As populations grow, the competition for space intensifies. Building underground offers a way to expand without spreading outward. Modern cities increasingly use underground space for this reason. Subway systems, parking garages, shopping centers, utility corridors. The Paris Catacombs were an early example of this principle, though applied to a macabre purpose. When you can't expand outward, you expand downward. A third motivation for underground construction is secrecy and security. Some things need to be hidden, either for legitimate security reasons or for less benign purposes. Metro 2 in Moscow, if it exists, would serve this function: a transportation system for government and military use that enemies couldn't easily target or even locate. The American underground facilities served similar purposes. Even if these installations could have been built on the surface with equivalent protection, placing them underground added an extra layer of security through concealment. Underground spaces are inherently difficult to observe. Satellites can photograph surface installations in great detail, but they can't see through earth and rock. Even ground-based surveillance has limited ability to detect what's happening underground. This makes underground facilities valuable for any activity that requires secrecy. Military command centers, intelligence operations, secure communications, or weapons storage. There's also a fourth motivation that's less often discussed but equally important: environmental stability. Underground spaces maintain relatively constant temperature and humidity year-round. They're protected from weather, from seasonal variations, from the daily cycle of heating and cooling. For certain purposes, this stability is valuable. The storage of sensitive equipment, archival materials, or supplies that degrade with temperature fluctuations all benefit from the stable underground environment. The underground cities we've explored were built for different specific reasons, but they all drew on one or more of these fundamental motivations: Derinkuyu protection and environmental stability, the Paris Catacombs, space efficiency, and later cultural memorialization, Beijing's underground city, protection from nuclear attack, Burlington and the American facilities, protection, secrecy, and continuity of operations. Each responded to particular circumstances, but each also reflected these deeper patterns in how humans use underground space. Let's consider what these patterns reveal about human psychology and society. The willingness to invest enormous resources in underground construction. The labor, the time, the expense indicates how seriously the builders took the threats they faced. The people who carved Derinkuyu weren't engaged in a casual project. They were committing generations of effort to creating a refuge, suggesting that the dangers they faced were persistent and severe enough to justify this extraordinary investment. Similarly, the Cold War bunkers represent massive commitments of resources based on threat assessment. Governments spent billions of dollars building facilities they hoped would never be used. This willingness to invest in protection against a threat that might never materialize reveals something about how societies handle existential risks. When the potential consequences are catastrophic, the destruction of civilization, the death of millions, even a relatively low probability of occurrence, justifies significant preventive measures. But there's a darker aspect to this calculation. The underground facilities built during the Cold War could protect only a tiny fraction of the population. Burlington could house 4,000 people out of Britain's population of millions. The American facilities had similar limitations. This raises uncomfortable questions about who gets protected and who doesn't. The decision to build these facilities implicitly accepted that most people would not survive a nuclear war. The facilities were designed to preserve government and military command structures, not to save the general population. This selective protection reflects a harsh reality about survival during catastrophic events. When resources are limited and threats are overwhelming, societies make choices about priorities. The underground cities embody these choices in concrete form, literally in the case of the modern bunkers. They reveal what societies value most when facing existential threats: continuity of government preservation, of command structures, maintenance of social order and authority. There's also a psychological dimension to underground construction that goes beyond practical considerations. Underground spaces have symbolic significance in many cultures. They're associated with death, with the underworld, with hidden knowledge and secret power. Building underground taps into these symbolic associations, whether intentionally or not. The Paris Catacombs make this symbolism explicit. They're literally called the Empire of Death, and the inscriptions throughout emphasize mortality and the transience of life. But even facilities built for purely practical purposes carry some of this symbolic weight. Descending into an underground bunker means leaving the world of light and life, entering a realm of artificial environments and controlled conditions. There's something psychologically significant about this transition, a sense of crossing a threshold into a different kind of existence. The people who designed these facilities understood this at some level, which is why they included features like the pub in Burlington or the movie theater in Beijing's underground city, attempts to maintain some semblance of normal life in an inherently abnormal environment. The question of why humans build underground also connects to broader questions about how we respond to threats and uncertainty. Underground construction is in a sense an admission of vulnerability. It acknowledges that the surface world can become uninhabitable, that our normal ways of life can be disrupted or destroyed. But it's also an assertion of agency and hope. By building underground, we're saying that survival is possible, that with sufficient planning and effort, we can endure even catastrophic events. This dual nature acknowledgement of vulnerability, combined with assertion of resilience, characterizes much of human response to existential threats. We build underground cities, stockpile supplies, develop contingency plans. These actions don't eliminate the threats, but they provide some sense of control, some feeling that we're not entirely helpless in the face of forces larger than ourselves. Looking across the different underground cities we've explored, certain patterns emerge. Underground construction tends to occur during periods of heightened threat perception, whether from military invasion, nuclear war, or other dangers. It requires significant resources and organization, which means it's typically undertaken by governments or large organized communities rather than individuals. And it reflects long-term thinking, a willingness to invest in protection against future threats, rather than focusing solely on immediate needs. These patterns suggest that underground construction serves as a kind of barometer for societal anxiety. When we see major underground building projects, we can infer that the society undertaking them perceives significant threats and has the resources and organization to respond. The proliferation of underground bunkers during the Cold War reflected the genuine fear of nuclear war that gripped both superpowers. The extensive underground cities of Cappadocia reflected the persistent military threats faced by communities in that region over many centuries. Today, we continue to build underground, though often for different reasons than in the past. Modern underground construction is more likely to be driven by space efficiency in crowded cities or by the need for secure facilities for data storage and communications. But the fundamental motivations remain protection efficiency, security and stability. The specific threats change, but the impulse to create safe, hidden, stable spaces beneath the surface endures. The underground cities we've explored stand as monuments to human ingenuity, determination, and fear. They show us what people are capable of achieving when survival is at stake. But they also reveal the limitations of our ability to protect ourselves from the worst threats we face. They're testaments to both human strength and human vulnerability, physical embodiments of our ongoing struggle to create safety and continuity in an uncertain world. We've traveled through time and across continents exploring some of the most remarkable underground cities ever created. We've descended into ancient refuges carved by civilizations long past, walked through tunnels lined with the bones of millions, and examined the Cold War bunkers built to survive nuclear apocalypse. But as we reach the end of our journey, one truth becomes increasingly clear. What we've seen represents only a fraction of what lies hidden beneath our feet. In Cappadocia, archaeologists estimate that only about 10% of the underground cities have been thoroughly explored and documented. The region contains more than 200 known underground settlements, but most remain largely unexamined. Many lie beneath modern towns and villages, making excavation difficult or impossible without disrupting contemporary life. Others are in remote areas where funding and access present challenges. And there's every reason to believe that additional underground cities remain completely undiscovered, waiting for another chance encounter like the one that revealed Derinkuyu in 1963. The discovery in 2013 of the massive underground complex beneath Nevşehir demonstrates how much remains unknown. This site, potentially larger than Derinkuyu itself, was found during routine construction work. It had been there for centuries or millennia, completely unknown to modern inhabitants of the city above. If such a large complex could remain hidden until the 21st century, what else might still be waiting to be found? The tunnels connecting the various underground cities present another mystery. Archaeologists have mapped some of these connections, but the full extent of the network remains unknown. Some tunnels have collapsed and are now impassable. Others have been deliberately sealed either by ancient inhabitants for defensive reasons or by more recent occupants who wanted to prevent access. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern surveying techniques could potentially map more of the network, but comprehensive surveys haven't been conducted. The complete picture of how the underground cities connected to each other and whether they functioned as a unified system remains elusive. Beneath Paris, the situation is similar. The official catacombs occupy about 2 kilometers of tunnel, but the total network of old quarry passages extends for 300 kilometers. Most of this vast underground labyrinth has never been systematically explored or mapped. The cataphiles have created detailed maps of the sections they frequent, but even they acknowledge that there are areas they've never reached, passages that remain unexplored. Occasionally, construction projects in Paris break through into previously unknown sections of the underground network. Workers drilling for building foundations or installing utility lines will suddenly find themselves looking into dark spaces that don't appear on any map. Sometimes these discoveries lead to official investigations and documentation. More often, they're simply sealed up and forgotten, becoming another lost piece of the underground puzzle. The question of what else might be hidden in the Paris tunnels is intriguing. The catacombs contain the bones of 6 million people, but the identification plaques mark only the cemeteries they came from, not individual identities. Among those millions of anonymous remains could be famous historical figures, important artists, or influential leaders. We'll never know. The individual stories have been lost, merged into the collective monument of bones. There are also rumors never confirmed of other things hidden in the Paris tunnels during various periods of upheaval. During the French Revolution, did fleeing aristocrats hide valuables in the tunnels? During World War II, did the resistance or the German occupiers stash weapons, documents, or looted art in hidden chambers? The tunnels would have been ideal for concealing things meant to stay hidden, and the vast unmapped sections would make recovery nearly impossible without specific knowledge of locations. In Beijing, the full extent of the underground city remains a state secret. The sections that were briefly open to tourists represented only a small portion of the total system. How much more exists? How deep does it go? Where exactly does it connect to? These questions have no public answers. The Chinese government maintains strict control over information about the underground city, and what lies in the sealed sections remains known only to those with appropriate security clearances. There are persistent reports of people still living in parts of the Beijing underground city, despite official efforts to clear the tunnels. In a city where housing costs have skyrocketed and space is at a premium, the empty tunnels offer shelter to those with nowhere else to go. But verifying these reports is difficult. The entrances are sealed and unauthorized access is illegal. The underground residents, if they exist, remain as hidden as the tunnels they inhabit. The question of Metro 2 in Moscow remains perhaps the most intriguing mystery. Does it exist? If so, how extensive is it? Is it still operational? The Russian government's refusal to confirm or deny creates a space where speculation flourishes. Every unexplained tunnel entrance, every mysterious construction project, every rumor from former workers adds to the mythology of Metro 2. But without official acknowledgement or concrete evidence, the truth remains hidden. What makes the Metro 2 question particularly fascinating is that it's a modern mystery. This isn't ancient history that's been lost over millennia. If Metro 2 exists, it was built within living memory by people who are still alive today. Workers who helped construct it, officials who planned it, maintenance personnel who serviced it. These people exist somewhere. They have knowledge that could answer the questions definitively. but they remain silent, bound by secrecy agreements, or simply unwilling to speak. The mystery persists not because the information has been lost to time, but because it's actively being kept secret. The American underground facilities present similar questions. We know about Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, and Mount Weather because their existence has been officially acknowledged. But how many other facilities exist that haven't been acknowledged? The United States has a long history of classified construction projects. Facilities are built in remote locations, often under cover stories, and their true purpose remains secret for decades. Some eventually become public knowledge. Others never do. The question of underground tunnels connecting American facilities remains unanswered. The technology to build such tunnels exists. The strategic logic for connecting facilities is sound. Witness testimony suggests that at least some tunnels exist. But without official confirmation or documentary evidence, we're left with possibilities rather than certainties. The tunnels may exist or they may not. The truth is hidden perhaps in classified documents that won't be declassified for decades, perhaps in the memories of people who aren't permitted to speak. Beyond the specific sites we've explored, there's the broader question of what other underground cities and facilities exist around the world. Every country with the resources and motivation has likely built some form of underground infrastructure. Some of this is mundane: subway systems, utility tunnels, storage facilities. But some is undoubtedly more significant: military installations, government bunkers, secure facilities for various purposes. Switzerland, for example, is known to have extensive underground facilities, including bunkers built to shelter the entire population in case of nuclear war. The country's civil defense program, maintained throughout the Cold War and continuing today, includes thousands of fallout shelters built into buildings and mountains. But the full extent of Switzerland's underground infrastructure isn't publicly known. How many facilities exist? How are they connected? What capabilities do they have? These details remain largely secret. Other countries have similar programs, though most are less open about them than Switzerland. Israel is believed to have extensive underground facilities, both for military purposes and for protecting critical infrastructure. North Korea has reportedly built vast underground complexes, including entire military bases and industrial facilities hidden beneath mountains. Iran has constructed underground nuclear facilities, some of which have been publicly acknowledged, while others remain suspected but unconfirmed. The challenge in understanding the full scope of underground construction worldwide is that the most significant facilities are by design secret. They're built in remote locations, their construction is classified, and their existence is often denied. We learn about them, if at all, through leaks, defectors' satellite imagery analysis, or eventual declassification. But for every facility we know about, there may be others that remain completely hidden. Modern technology has made it somewhat easier to detect underground construction. Satellite imagery can identify construction activity and the movement of large amounts of earth. Seismic monitoring can detect underground excavation. Intelligence agencies have various methods for discovering hidden facilities. But the earth itself remains an effective shield. Deep underground construction, if done carefully, can still escape detection. And even when facilities are detected, their purpose and capabilities may remain unknown. There's also the question of what might be discovered in the future. As cities expand and development continues, construction projects will inevitably break through into unknown underground spaces. Some of these will be natural caves or geological formations, but others may be human-made, forgotten tunnels, sealed chambers, or even entire complexes that have been lost to history. Each such discovery has the potential to rewrite our understanding of what lies beneath. Climate change and rising sea levels may also reveal underground secrets. As coastal areas flood and erosion patterns change, previously hidden entrances may be exposed. Archaeological sites that have been buried for centuries may become accessible. The changing environment will literally uncover what has been hidden. The underground cities we've explored in this journey: Derinkuyu, the Paris Catacombs, Beijing's shelter system, Burlington, and the others represent what we know. They're the visible portion of a much larger reality. Beneath our feet in cities and countryside around the world lie countless spaces that remain hidden. Some are known to authorities but kept secret. Others are known only to small groups of people who guard their knowledge carefully. And some are completely unknown, waiting for chance or intention to bring them to light. These hidden spaces represent layers of history, secrets of the past and present, and preparations for futures that may or may not come to pass. They remind us that the world we see on the surface is incomplete, that there are depths, literal and figurative, that remain unexplored. The underground cities we visited are remarkable achievements, but they're also invitations to wonder about what else might be hidden, what other stories remain untold, what other secrets are still buried in the darkness beneath our feet. As we conclude our exploration, we're left with more questions than answers, and perhaps that's appropriate. The underground world, by its nature, resists complete knowledge. It remains partially hidden, partially mysterious, a realm where certainty gives way to speculation, and where the known fades into the unknown. The secrets buried beneath the surface may eventually come to light, or they may remain hidden forever, silent witnesses to human ingenuity, fear, and the eternal drive to create spaces of safety and survival in an uncertain world. Over the past 2.5 hours, we've descended into some of the most remarkable hidden spaces ever created. We began in Cappadocia, exploring Derinkuyu's 18 levels, carved deep into volcanic rock, a refuge for 20,000 people with sophisticated ventilation, water systems, and defensive doors. We considered the various peoples who built and used these underground cities across millennia, each adding their own layer to this subterranean world. From Turkey, we traveled to Paris, where 6 million people rest in tunnels lined with carefully arranged bones. We saw how abandoned quarries became an ossuary, solving a crisis while creating a monument to mortality. We discovered the hidden world beyond 300 kilometers, where cataphiles explore spaces few will ever see. We journeyed to Beijing's underground city, dug by hand during the Cold War. We examined Moscow's rumored Metro 2 and Britain's Burlington. We explored America's network, Cheyenne Mountain, Raven Rock, Mount Weather, and the questions about whether tunnels connect them. Throughout, we've asked, why do humans build underground? The answers are multiple: protection, space, efficiency, security, stability. But we've also seen something deeper, a psychological need for refuge, for a final place of safety when all else fails. What emerges is a pattern spanning cultures and centuries. When facing existential threats, we turn to the earth. We dig down, creating spaces, offering protection and continuity. These underground cities are testaments to human ingenuity, but also to our vulnerability and fear. This story matters because it reveals how we respond to danger. The people who built these spaces were asserting that survival is possible, that with planning and effort, we can endure catastrophe. These spaces remind us that history is layered, that beneath what we see lies depth and complexity. History is not complete. New discoveries continue. In Cappadocia, 90% of underground cities remain unexplored. The complex discovered beneath Nevşehir in 2013 was completely unknown until workers broke through. Beneath Paris, most tunnels have never been mapped. The full extent of underground infrastructure in Beijing, Moscow, and America remains classified or unknown. This incompleteness is compelling. We're dealing with ongoing mysteries with spaces that guard their secrets, with questions that may never be fully answered. The underground cities connect us to people across time who faced unimaginable challenges but responded with creativity and hope. Studying the past gives us perspective. The Cold War bunkers remind us that threats may not materialize as we fear. Ancient Cappadocia shows us human resilience. The Paris Catacombs remind us of mortality's inevitability and the possibility of finding meaning within it. The underground cities don't provide easy answers, but they offer perspective. They show us how others wrestled with similar challenges. They demonstrate what humans can achieve working together and the limitations of even our most ambitious efforts. Thank you for joining this journey into hidden spaces. Let these thoughts settle gently. Let the images of underground cities, of tunnels stretching into darkness, fade into the background of your mind. Rest peacefully, knowing that beneath the surface, there are still secrets waiting to be discovered, still stories waiting to be told. Good night.